Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. 1, 2, 3. Good morning, everybody. We are going to get started. Welcome to California Native Garden Design. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center. And I want to make a couple of quick notes before we get started. That's the first slide. This presentation is being recorded. And after some light editing next week, you will be able to rewatch it on our YouTube channel at cbwcd.org/YouTube. The link is here on the screen. And I'm going to type that into the chat really quickly in case we need to refer back to that later. cbwcd.org/YouTube. And that will bring you right to a playlist of all sorts of past recorded workshops. So I will be mentioning some of those other workshops that might be useful to use in addition to the information that we are covering here today for that. Additionally, you can download all of the slides from this presentation at the other link that you see on the screen. That's cbwcd.org/presentations. Typing that into the chat right now as well. /presentations. And there you will be able to look for California Native Garden Design. It's just a list of links to the PDF files of the full presentations from all the workshops that we teach if you want to download them as references. So it's a pretty large file. And what you want to do is when you find California Native Garden Design listed there, that's actually a link. So you can right click on that and then select Save Linked File As, and it will download to your computer. And so that's going to be a file with all of the slides. And so with that, let's get started. Before we get into it, I want to tell you just a little bit about the organization that I come from. We are the Waterwise Community Center. Our formal name is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. And we are a special district, so similar to a school district or a fire district. We serve the western edge of San Bernardino County in Southern California, and we were created by a public vote back in 1949 to specifically provide water conservation services to our local community. And so we are not a water service provider. We don't provide anybody's water at their home or their business directly. We don't bill people for water, but we work very closely with the local water suppliers on conservation programs. We say that our mission is threefold: to percolate, to demonstrate, and to educate. Percolation, like you can see here on the right, has long been sort of the bread and butter of what our agency does. Essentially, we own and operate in coordination with other local water agencies a number of large holes in the ground, most of which are literally old gravel pits, which have been re-engineered and reconfigured to accept, clean, and infiltrate stormwater into our local groundwater basin that would otherwise be lost to our communities when it rains. And some of them also, in coordination with other water agencies, take and percolate recycled as well as sometimes imported water to recharge our local groundwater supply, which is actually about 60% of our water supply in our area. That's kind of unique for Southern California, and we exist to help preserve that and make sure that water is used well. So on the demand side of water conservation, we also operate a beautiful, close to 3-acre demonstration garden, as well as a park at our headquarters facility in Montclair, Southern California, just south of the 10 freeway, close to Claremont and Ontario, if you're not familiar with the community of Montclair. So please come visit us. We're open 6 days a week, every day except Sunday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. for free to the public to come and enjoy and check out plants and different garden styles. And we also do lots of education for all sorts of different audiences, from curriculum integrated K through 12 field trips to internships with higher education students, for residents within our local service area, one-on-one services, as well as workshops and trainings for local community members and professionals. The easiest way to stay in the loop with everything we have going on is to sign up for our newsletter, which you can do at cbwcd.org/newsletter. If you don't get that already, highly encourage you to sign up for that. We don't share your email with anybody else. You just get one email a month with all of our upcoming programs and workshops, sometimes some other great water conservation content, and no junk at all. So I'm putting that to the chat right now. And then briefly, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center, and I have been working in various aspects of the landscape industry for the past 17-ish years now. And that has included everything from landscape maintenance to landscape design and construction management. My academic training, I have a master's degree in landscape architecture. And I spent 8 years working in the public gardens world, doing landscape design, construction management, and horticulture management before I came to work at the Waterwise Community Center. And through most of the later stage of that, I really have been focused on working with California native plants and California native gardens, and plants and gardens that are really, really well adapted to this place. And in my opinion, kind of the most beautiful and interesting kinds of landscapes we can have. So my partner and I are often going hiking on our free time on the weekends and looking at some of these native plants in their wild habitat. Some of them grow well in our home gardens, some of them do not. Some of them can be adapted to it and look a little less wild and woolly, and taking inspiration from that, as well as combining that with kind of more traditional garden styles and techniques. So we'll talk a lot about that, and I'll show you some projects and examples as we go. And so that's a little bit about me. And now is the time where you tell me just a little bit about yourself. I just launched a quick opening poll with 5 questions that helps us get some of our metrics that we need to track and evaluate our programs. And then the last question is always the most interesting to me. It tells me a little bit about who's in the audience based on what kind of plants you currently have, if you have any plantings that you currently are caring for. So please take just a moment to fill that out, and then we will get into it. Thank you very much. For those of you joining us from farther away areas than our local communities, welcome. Everybody is very welcome here today. Please let us know in the chat where you are here from. It's always very interesting. Sacramento, San Buenaventura, Contra Costa County, Fresno, Everett, Washington, interesting, Riverside, Walnut Creek, Antelope Valley, Moreno Valley, Palmdale, West Hollywood, San Jose. Very cool. Welcome, everybody. Long Beach. Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing. There's some people are finishing up the poll, and then we'll wrap it up in just a moment. So what you are going to see here is going to be somewhat California centric. That's just because where I live and work. The principles will apply anywhere in California. But what you'll want to do is, if there's specific plants that you like, that you see, there's going to be a lot of labeled plants and examples. Definitely check to make sure that that will grow in your local area. There are, in most areas of California, local native plant societies. There's another website that I will show later on that can help you kind of figure that out. A lot of them will grow anywhere in the state pretty well in terms of the places that people are joining us from, but especially if you live in kind of a much wetter area of California, or up in the mountains, or somewhere that gets significant frost, definitely do a little bit of double checking. Okay, and with that, I will just quickly like to let everybody know, it's always very interesting to me what kind of plantings that the people in the audience currently have. So about 43% of people have some turf or lawn, and we're not here to tell you got to get rid of all of it, but we encourage people to think about how much of it do they actively use and need, and maybe doing something more interesting with the rest of the space. 60% of people have some sort of general water-wise plants, things like lavender, rosemary, and lantana. 53% already have at least one or a few California native plants. That number has been steadily ticking up as I've been teaching this topic. And so that's really cool to see. Things are going in the right direction. Succulents, 60%, fruit trees, 53%, veggie beds, about a third, 33%. That's pretty high. A lot of gardening enthusiasts then. And 47% higher water using ornamentals, roses, azaleas, etc. Very cool. So whether you are brand new to California native plants, don't really know what a California native plant is, or have been working with native plants for a while, but are interested in learning some more perspectives maybe, or just one person's different perspective on design with them, should be something for everybody today. So thank you for participating in the poll. And then last thing, very briefly, before we jump into it, is how to ask questions and interact with me today. I encourage you to ask questions. What we find is that on these online workshops, I don't call on people who raise their hand because there's a lot of downtime with audio issues, video issues. And so to keep things running smoothly with a relatively large group is you will see in your Zoom interface a button you can press that says Q&A and has 2 text bubbles. That is the best way to ask me questions, because when you type a question in there, that goes into a little window that I have off of the screen that I'm sharing, and it keeps all the questions very well organized, and I can kind of check them off one by one as I go. The chat, which is the button that says chat with just one text bubble, that's great for any comments. I always read all of that afterwards. Sometimes people have additional resources that they want to share with the rest of the group. That's great. But when questions go into the chat that are aimed at me, oftentimes I'll miss them just because I can't track it the same way as when they go into the Q&A function. So please use that one. And because we have a ton to cover today, what I'm going to do is I'll work my way through a section of what we are talking about today, and then I will stop and I will catch up on all the questions that have come through. As we go, the questions that I will have time to answer are going to be the ones really pertaining to the topic we're talking about. If you have more specific questions that are more like, this is my exact situation, and what do you think? I'm happy to answer as many of those as I can, but I'll need to hold some of those till the end of the workshop, and then I'm happy to stay until afternoon to answer as many of those as I can. So Susan just asked about guides to plant selection. We will look at some online guides later on in this workshop. So here's what we are going to be covering today, our outline for the workshop. We'll talk about why we might be interested in planting California native gardens for people who are curious or just getting into it. We'll talk about where do you even start when you're thinking about design. We'll take some inspiration from our Southern California wild plant communities. We'll look at elements of native garden design, our kind of conceptual toolbox to ground us and direct us as we start thinking about designs for our spaces. We'll talk about the process of selecting plants, a couple of great online resources for doing that. Then we'll go through a detailed example of the design process. And then, time depending, we'll talk about the basics of using native garden design for wildlife habitat. And that's really just sort of a teaser for another class I recently taught, which is recorded online. That's about gardening for birds, butterflies, pollinators, and more through the lens of working with native plants. And then we'll have some wrap-up additional resources and questions. So let's get into it. For those of you who have taken our landscape transformation basics class, you're familiar with this question, but it's a good starting point for this workshop as well. Landscapes take up a lot of space in Southern California. If you look at most of the residential areas of Southern California on an aerial photo, for example, on Google Earth or something like that, it looks a little bit different than downtown Los Angeles or New York City. At the street level, we might feel like there's too much concrete or asphalt, and quite possibly there is. But what you see is actually quite a lot of green in our neighborhoods, most of the neighborhoods, even if our neighborhoods, again, at the street level don't have enough street trees, which is very common, or other green spaces that are accessible to the public. Just looking at percentage of land cover, there's a bunch of space. And for a long time, especially in the typical suburban front yard, the question has been just, does it fit in with the neighbors? Or if someone wants to go beyond that, what does it look like? And what it looks like is important. Our gardens should be beautiful. They should enhance the feel of our communities. But the last series of droughts really, in my mind, opened up an opportunity for a new leading question. Beauty is the minimum, but that's not enough. We put effort into our landscapes. They are these precious pieces of open space that we can choose what's going to happen there. So I really want us to think about, what do our landscapes do? What do we want them to do for us? What do we want them to do for the world or in the world? And when you look at that through that frame, whether it's turf, if it's not getting used, or even if it's a traditional ornamental landscape, other than requiring lots of inputs of water and labor and maybe fertilizer, or for some people, chemicals, they don't do that much for us. California native landscapes do more. One of the big ideas from the class, and we will get into that extensively. But first, let's define what a California native plant is. There's different technical definitions. There's no just only one definition. Some people include Baja California, other people don't. We could split hairs about it and spend all day on it. But for the purposes of this class, and for most Homer community gardeners, we can say a California native plant is generally considered to be a plant that has been here in California for a very long time. It evolved in California along with the insects, birds, and other animals that evolved in California as well back in history. And so why is that an important thing? What makes those plants special? Well, a couple of the big ones for me is that these plants, if they're selected well for our area, so they're native to the state of California and they match the local conditions, weather, and environment, they can be very well adapted to our local conditions, the intense heat inland, the dry climate, the different soils that we have, requiring very little input from us to keep them very happy and to allow them to thrive. And in addition to that, this is the really important one, the relationships with other native plants and animals. And so in general, and this is a big generalization, but it holds true overall. In general, if you plant a diverse garden filled with primarily native plants, that garden will do a much, much better job supporting all of our local wildlife that we want to have in our garden and that we want to support. So talking about native birds, butterflies, native pollinators, all these things which are still losing habitat to this day. California is a state, although there are a lot of environmental regulations, still extremely high threat for biodiversity loss. There's a lot of biodiversity in Southern California, and we are still building a lot of suburbs. And so what we do in our yards isn't all of the solution, but it is a part of continuing to provide suitable homes for the wild world that we would like to invite in. And most cases, you don't need to worry about putting in native plants and having a mountain lion in your yard. It's the birds, the insects, the pollinators, and some of the lizards that are going to be travel around more. So why would we want them in our gardens? Well, for me, this is something that I enjoy every single day. So here are some pictures from the last time I taught this class, maybe a couple of times ago. This would have been in the spring, I think. I'm trying to remember these series of pictures and if it was spring or fall. This year, I'm teaching it a little bit earlier in the year, so there's not quite as much in bloom, though there are a ton of blooms in the yard. And I really have time to take pictures this morning, but this was just one morning before I taught the class that wandered out into the yard. So woolly blue curls in bloom. This thing blooms in my yard almost all year and doesn't want any water. Occasionally, if it feels like it should rain in the winter, but hasn't, I'll water it once. So I think this has gotten a little bit of water twice this year in our dry winter, and it won't get any in the summer. Blooms almost year round. Our yard is always filled with birds. At any given moment in the morning, there's probably at least 5 different species of birds, sometimes more, either eating seeds, using bird baths, roosting in trees in our yard. Supporting native pollinators. And for example, in this Allen Chickering sage, it's one of the best smelling plants in the world, smells amazing, beautiful flower, supports pollinators. Birds love the bird baths as well as the flowers and seeds. Lots of beauty. Like I said, beauty is the minimum. Things can be blooming year round in much of California. In our yards, if you're somewhere where it gets really, really cold in the winter, that might not be as much of the case. But here in inland or coastal Southern California, year-round blooms, no problem. Have a patch of milkweed that we use to support monarch caterpillars. And it truly is, if you build it, they will come. And so, within a year, significant monarch habitat in our yard, hopefully contributing over time to a series of these mini habitats in our local community. And then really enjoying the dynamic cycles of what's going on. And so we talk about this a lot in our habitat focused gardening class, but it's not just all about as many flowers all the time and needing to clip things back every couple of days to keep the flowers going. There will be a ton of flowers, and then letting plants actually go through their natural cycles of drying out, going to seed, turning into bird food, and really enjoying the wild beauty and contrast of plants going throughout their season. Lots of plants provide great nectar for butterflies as well as pollinators. Adding in some rock and some old branches, great habitat for lizards. We have resident hummingbirds who live in our yard. And so that's just one morning, and throughout the year that changes quite a bit. And there's always something different going on all of the time throughout the year with the plants and with the animals that come. So why would we want them in our gardens? To just go through the concepts we kind of talked about in the example, but beauty. These are some of my favorite California native plants for residential gardens, all of which, after they're established, require water usually once a month, depending on your soils, maybe every 3 weeks, a good deep soak, a fraction of the water of a lawn. If you really want to go kind of bare bones, you can plant a garden that can largely exist after it's established on rainfall in the average year, a couple of supplemental soaks in the winter. Most gardeners, though, are going to water a little bit more, a good deep soak once a month in the months where it doesn't rain or doesn't do more than a little bit of sprinkle. But you can still easily, even in a well-watered native garden, you'll be watering less than a quarter of what a lawn requires. Habitat, we already talked about that, and that could look very kind of wild if that's what you're into, or it could look much more kind of traditional and cultivated if that's what you're into, but you can still provide the habitat either way. And so, for example, we have hawks as semi-regular visitors to our yard, partially because of the plant structures, partially because of all the other life there, and partially because of providing water in our native garden. So I already jumped ahead and talked about the resource conservation part. And in addition, the vast majority of native plants need, especially if you select them well, and we'll talk about that later, they're well selected for your soils. They don't need any fertilizer. They don't need any compost in most soils. So it's less work for us to do. And it also requires fewer inputs, which have many environmental benefits. Ease of care is one of them. You can work smarter in your garden instead of harder. The vast majority of these plants are low maintenance, meaning nothing is in a home garden for the most part. Anything wants some care. If you really want to let it go wild, you can kind of do a restoration project and let it go. But most of us, it's really going to still require some care, but it's much different than the typical traditional ornamental landscape, which is a lot of work in the summer, especially mowing lawns. The vast majority of our native plants, they want a little bit of cleanup or cutback, or some of them a significant cutback, but generally no more than once a year. If you're really, really trying to be on top of it, some plants you might touch for maintenance a couple times a year, but most of that, depending on the plant, is in the spring or in the fall when it's pretty nice to be outside, and very little to do in the summer other than maybe pulling some weeds and occasional irrigation and enjoying your space. And all that makes our yards more enjoyable places to live and to learn as our plants and the critters who visit our gardens go through those seasonal changes. I really like this quote from Lady Bird Johnson, former First Lady. She was one of the first to be covered in the national news. People have worked with native plants since time immemorial, since they lived in those areas. But in terms of like national media attention, Lady Bird Johnson helped usher in some interest among kind of common suburban people in native plants. And I like this quote of hers. She said that native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. And I am quite a bit more cynical than Lady Bird Johnson, but I feel like it costs a lot to live in California. And if I'm lucky enough to have a little patch of yard where I can decide what's going to happen there, why would I want it to look like a parched imitation of an East Coast landscape style, which really goes back with the lawn to like a rich European landowner landscape style, showing off that they don't need to use their space for anything more productive than having a big flat area of grass. It doesn't make sense for the way most of us live. Maybe one small patch of lawn for the dog or the kids if they're going to use it. But kind of for our default landscape style, I would much rather wake up to the natural beauty of California every day, enjoy it every evening, enjoy the smells, the sights, the sounds, know I'm contributing to meaningful wildlife habitat as I enjoy seeing the birds, butterflies, and pollinators and lizards in my yard, and have it require less water and less work. So seems like a good way to go. And it gives your cat something very interesting to look at. And so with that, we're going to transition to talking about some of the big ideas behind native gardening, but we had a number of questions coming in first, so let's answer them. So from George, when I talked about California, do I mean the state of California or the California floristic province, which includes some parts of Baja, northern Nevada, southern Oregon, and desert provinces in California, including the Mojave Desert, and we also have Colorado Desert and other desert areas. So good question, George. That's kind of a more technical one if you're new to native plants. I tend to be inclusive. So what I generally mean coming from Southern California is the California floristic province plus, so that includes Baja, plus the desert as well, where we are based in inland Southern California. We are in the beginning of a transition. So we are definitely a Mediterranean climate. We're definitely not true desert yet, but there are both a number of plants that grow here as well as in some of the desert provinces. And then additionally, a lot of the desert plants that grow in kind of Mojave, Colorado desert will grow very well for us here, especially, for example, like I live in Pomona. We definitely have some urban heat island effect going on. And in the summer, when a lot of our local native plants are no longer as active, the desert plants are really extending the bloom season. So, working with plants that I don't necessarily see hiking around here, but some of them that I saw earlier in the week when I was on vacation in Anza Borrego. So I like to be inclusive, and then other people, some people who want to only plant local native plants, if that's what you're into, that's great. Okay, so how many milkweed plants did I have when I noticed monarch caterpillars? I think we planted 2 or 3, but if they're happy, they spread all over the place. And so ours are actually near our fruit trees where they get more water than a typical native garden. They actually like water. In where I've seen them in habitat locally, they kind of grow not right at the water, but kind of in dappled shade a little bit farther away from the streams. They grow other places as well, but that's kind of where they're super happy. And so they get extra water from our fruit trees down at the bottom of our yard, and they're able to spread. And so it's a big old clump now. But oftentimes the monarchs will show up the first year, if not the first year, the second. Okay, from Fernand, does native have the same meaning as drought tolerant? Good question. No, it does not. Native, like we talked about, that means a plant that evolved here. So rosemary might be considered drought tolerant, but that's from the Mediterranean. Lantana might be considered drought tolerant, but that's from Australia. So there are a lot of drought tolerant plants that are from other parts of the world that are either desert climates or similar Mediterranean climates to ours that might be drought tolerant, but that doesn't mean they're native. They don't necessarily have that connection with this place, and they haven't necessarily co-evolved with the bird and other wildlife species, the insect species, to really provide for their needs as well. So that's why natives, one of the reasons why natives do so much more, and to me are more interesting, because they really reflect our sense of place. Now, that's not to say, I have a rosemary plant in my yard because I like to use it when I roast potatoes. I have fruit trees and vegetables. It doesn't need to be all or nothing. When I work with people on design, sometimes we mix native and non-native plants, as long as, we'll talk about it later, the factors for growing them match. So it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. And in the same way, when we talk about native plants, to a place, it depends on how wide ranging you're looking at, because redwood trees are native to California, but they require a lot of resources, and even with a ton of water, don't always grow very well in Southern California. So we'll talk about selecting the native plants for your area later on. And then just one question that I might as well answer as we go through, because this would be the logical time, about the woolly blue curls plant that I showed. How often did I water it during the establishment period? A few times the first year, but I'm really big on planting them in the fall after it's starting to cool off, so they can take a little bit more water. And it's kind of just paying attention and guessing. So not quite once a week, although the first few weeks in the cool weather I probably did, just to really make sure that it's soaked in well. Okay. So let's keep going. Some great questions so far. So here are going to be our big kind of guiding ideas for working with native plants and native gardening. A garden is a living ecosystem. A garden is not like buying a new couch, putting in your living room, and as long as the cat doesn't shred it, it should be there for a very long time, and it won't change. You're not going to come in and your couch has grown into something else. And it's not like a home decorating show where, 3 days and all of a sudden everything's all done. A garden is in process. It's never finished. It's always in motion. So I'll show you lots of pictures from my yard later. So this is an area of my yard that I got to like 2 years after I started the rest of my yard. It was kind of a back corner. And you don't need to do it all at once, or even if you're transitioning away from lawn, you don't need to do it all at once. If you have a large enough yard, even if you know exactly what you're doing, occasionally some things will die, and it's a good chance to try something else in that area. And thinking this way is more liberating, more fun, and much more interesting. We talked about seasons. So this example is, I showed a picture of a bird in this bird bath surrounded by wildflowers earlier in this presentation. Because this is a wildflower meadow, those wildflowers are annual plants that come back from seed. And so they dry out in the midsummer, and especially going into fall. And I don't live in an urban wildland interface where we have high fire danger. I just live in the suburbs of Pomona. And so we allow this to be like this and have its own kind of rugged beauty. And it's just filled with birds eating the seeds. It's our bird feeder kind of meadow. And we actually have planted a few more kind of evergreen shrubs in here over time. But to us, this is part of the beauty, just as important to our part of gardening and our philosophy of gardening at my house as those really beautiful flowers from the woolly blue curls. Every bit as important and beautiful. And part of the beauty is the aesthetic of the seed heads and the contrast, which is hard to photograph, but is there in person. And part of the beauty is just the cycle. And, there's not much going on with the plants here in terms of living material, but when I open the window in my laundry room every morning during this time of year, there's tons and tons of birds out here. So that's part of the beauty as well. This might be unappealing to you. This is not for everybody. So it's up to you. But thinking about those options and not just the snapshot of garden design or the glossy magazine photo of garden design is way more liberating. It's way more fun. And it's so much more interesting. It means that our gardening and our landscapes become based in a larger world of natural science. And that gives us a way to root our designs and actions in the garden other than just, plant 3 of these pink things next to 2 of those orange things, which once you start doing this kind of gardening, doesn't seem that important anymore. And this actually makes gardening success much easier for casual gardeners. But where do you start? If you've seen many of my other workshops, you've seen this slide and this idea before. You don't start here. You don't start at the nursery for many reasons. Even if it's a really good nursery, even if the staff can provide great recommendations. You want to use that resource, but that's not where you start if you're planting more than just a couple of things. If you just need one shrub to fill a gap, then take a picture on your phone, go to a great local nursery and ask them for recommendations, and then read up about that plant online as well. That's just fine. But if you're thinking about really doing a garden design, when you go to the nursery, you end up with one of this and two of that and a mismatch, and you're not really setting yourself up for success. And so just in terms of inspiration, not necessarily design, maybe we'll start here, at least for today, in the San Gabriel Mountains. This is the local kind of repository in my area for both native plant biodiversity as well as inspiration. And so in looking at our local wild landscapes, I am not saying that I want my front yard or my backyard to look like this. I do not. This is a little wild and woolly for even me, the guy with the dried out wildflowers. However, there is lots to learn. So I want to take you on a walk that I went on a few years ago during kind of a peak drought moment this is 2 droughts ago now. But yeah, kind of peak historic drought moment, and seeing what looks good in a canyon that had some very exposed areas as well as some shady areas up above Pasadena area in the middle of August during this historic drought. And one of the interesting things about native plants is that certainly in certain wild areas in the middle of a drought, individual plants are suffering. And certainly with climate change, where certain plants are going to be able to grow is going to shift some. But if you look at the kind of historic record of droughts throughout kind of the evolution of our plants and plant communities, Southern California or California has seen really pretty gnarly droughts before. Interestingly, most of the development of California, you can see here in this blue, 1900 to 2000s is when most of the kind of modern development, the population growth, cities, suburbs, all of that happened in a particularly wet period. If that happened during one of these historical dry periods, lawns wouldn't have even been an option. And so California native plants, for the most part, are adapted to these kind of disturbances in what we had the illusion of being our normal access to water resources. And so with just a little bit of care and help from us, they can look great year after year, whether it's a wet year or a dry year. And so in this walk, important things that I want you to look at. Don't worry too much about individual species. We'll talk about selecting species later. I'll mention some names. Some of these are great for home gardens. Some of them are not. Some of them grow best in the wild. But things to look at are plant density and what is on the ground as we go. So as I started this hike, was August, middle of historic drought, and this was still on an asphalt service road in full blasting afternoon sun. We have California coffeeberry, which happens to be a very lush looking evergreen plant that is one of my favorites for home gardens, looking fine in the middle of that and that brutal reflected heat. And then on the ground layer, we have things like California Fuchsia, wonderful perennial, and look at that kind of accumulation of organic matter on the ground. Southern California gardening is not just gravel and a couple of cacti by any means. We have in the middle of this historic drought, oak trees. This is Coast Live oak, which we will talk about later, coming up from a seed and still growing pretty well in this weird crack along the side of an access road. Beautiful feathers of mountain mahogany, the flowers of datura. Even up on these cracks with hardly any soil, this is laurel sumac, Melosma laurina, beautiful, very green, evergreen shrub growing in hardly any soil, reflected western facing heat. These plants really can take it. And then slowing down for the smaller moments of a native aster flower. A lot of the asters are great plants for our butterfly gardens, very, very tough. And you can see it's growing in some of this accumulated leaf litter, kind of a log here helping preserve some of the moisture probably underneath the log. Toyon looking great as well. We'll talk about Toyon later, one of my very favorite plants for home gardens. It's kind of the central spot in my front yard. Sugar bush, so lots of evergreen sort of stuff. And so one of the things as we think about design and how do we make our yards look good and not just super wild is combining evergreen California native plants as a structure with some of the plants then that'll be in beautiful flower parts of the year and might kind of go a little bit dormant, and then mixing in as well wood and stone if we are able to. California buckwheat blooms throughout so much of the year in our home gardens and such a great habitat plant and shrub. California fuchsia. And so you can see here as well, though, not all plants need that highly organic soil. We looked at some of them, and because in some of the canyon situations from the trees, it's available, but also some of these plants are growing here in this native soil, but it's essentially kind of like decomposed granite. They don't need huge, lush amounts of organic matter. It can kind of take whatever lean soils that we have, as long as we're selecting the plants well. Oak woodlands. This is the best place to be on a hot day in Southern California, natural air conditioning. And so you might not have enough space for an entire oak woodland in your yard. You probably don't, but maybe you have room for one oak tree or some smaller trees to provide some sense of shade and shelter. And then maybe you have a more exposed area with your really, really colorful favorite native plants. Manzanita, beautiful shrub. Look at this new growth in the middle of the drought, and look at that beautiful bark. And again, even in this drought, here we have tiny little seedlings of California sagebrush coming up, protected by that little bit of organic matter that naturally accumulated. So what does that mean for what we might want to do in our yards? Well, there's different ways to go. We'll talk about a couple ways, but I like to kind of base this understanding in what are called plant communities of Southern California. And a plant community is, again, this is another one of those concepts that people can get way into and whether or not they even exist. But essentially, for our purposes, a plant community is kind of a grouping of different plants and conditions that kind of grow well together. And I'll show you examples. Now, individual plants might show up in a variety of different plant communities, and they actually do. But one of the big first ideas is we might grow desert plants, and some of you might live in a desert or the desert transition areas. But in most of Southern Central California, if you are west of the mountains or south of the mountains, where the range kind of goes a little bit more east-west, then you are not truly living in a desert. You are living in a semi-arid Mediterranean climate. The difference being that our rain comes in the winter, if we get it, almost exclusively. Occasionally we get a summer thunder shower, and we still generally get a little bit more than a true desert area. And so our our plant communities, our oak woodland is one of them. And even here, looking at natural areas, if you go up into our local oak woodlands, especially in the canyons, you will see walls of ferns. I mean, things that people who don't get out into the wild world think would never grow in Southern California. These oak woodlands have high levels of organic matter. So the woodland plants do like a wood chip mulch. You can see here, this is a granary from acorn woodpeckers, support lots of life and biodiversity. Growing in that are mushrooms, which most of the time are beneficial. Not all, but if you see something like this in your yard, it's usually more of a sign of something going right. You don't need to necessarily try to get rid of it. It's generally going to be growing in a symbiotic benefit with your plants, or totally ignoring your plants and breaking down the organic matter, but turning that into eventually compost that will join the soil and make nutrients available. In our kind of drier, more exposed areas, we have what's called chaparral. That's a lot of our shrubs, and that is characterized, even in these very rocky areas, by a pretty high plant density. So again, we're not talking about a whole yard full of mulch and like 3 plants. These plants like to grow close to each other. We need to leave ourselves room for access and to care for our plants and to have little patio spaces and stuff. But these plants like to rub elbows with each other, and it helps them thrive. And so that a lot of plants are high plant density. If we're working with native plants, it doesn't mean a lot of supplemental water. Beautiful spring blooming vine, native vine clematis, can be very low water, still get that look. And there's lots of different chaparral. So depending on where you would be in your local wild areas, it could be very rocky and a little bit more space in between, or it can be very dense. And here we have, impassable by people unless you're on a trail. So I'm standing on a trail here, taking pictures of a whole hillside filled with this blue flowering ceanothus. This is a little higher elevation, so there's some pine trees. So much beauty. And so one way to take inspiration is to then kind of take inspiration from some of these plant communities and use that as the basis of a design. And then you might be working with other factors like traditional design elements of repetition or contrast between plants. This is an example of a planting design I did at the Huntington Botanical Gardens, where I used to work, where it was inspired by chaparral, but because this was a berm and this was sort of a area outside of an auditorium space, we wanted to keep the plants lower. And so working with a dwarf version of the local native sagebrush and a dwarf version of the local native black sage, and then having the band of grasses be a little farther away. So kind of a little bit more visual order, kind of balancing that looseness, but still very much inspired by chaparral. And then kind of in the more center area of that garden, this was a mixed garden of native and Mediterranean species. We wanted lots of biodiversity to kind of reflect the biodiversity of the greater garden. And so it was a balance between a formal hedge, which was a Mediterranean, not a native species, with then kind of still inspired by chaparral, lots of different shrubs of different colors, kind of rubbing elbows with each other, like you saw in some of those wild pictures, to get these moments of kind of riotous color and contrast and beauty. Oak Savannah is another one of my favorite landscapes. You can have 2 oak trees in your yard and just some loose native grasses and rocks underneath, with a little bit of wildflower that comes up every spring, maybe a little patio there. Super low maintenance, gorgeous. What more do you need if you want to keep it simple? So Santa Rosa Plateau is my favorite place to visit for that inspiration. It's currently closed as it's recovering from wildfire, sensitive ecological area. And here is an example from a very high-end landscape architect named Bernard Trainer, who does a lot of work in Central California. And in some of his properties, that's kind of what they do. Like just what I mentioned, I forgot this exact picture, but 2 oak trees, native grasses, and some herbaceous, as well as I'm sure some annual wildflowers. So here's yarrow amongst the grasses. Here's an example of just a close-up on a very small scale of something that I did in the yard of one of the places that I rented, where we had a backyard filled with fruit trees. And so we mixed some native meadow grass that can take a little bit more water, and then some native perennials. So this is blue-eyed grass and a native ranunculus in the background for beautiful spring color. And we just cut the whole thing back with a string trimmer every once in a while. Riparian zones as well. Now, a riparian zone basically means creekside. In a lot of Southern California, we have seasonal riparian zones. So in the wet season, they'll run and then they'll kind of dry out and be gravelly washes in the drier season. Now, we might not want to use these exact plants in our yards because, like these plants, for example, alders would take a lot of water to keep happy in the average residential yard. Maybe if you're working with a gray water system, you would consider it. But we can get inspiration definitely for what we do in our landscapes at home, both aesthetically, as well as when we build things like a dry creek bed that will capture the water coming off of our roof. We can build something like this. And then because it's so dry, you can use a variety of different plant material, not necessarily high water plants, at sort of the edges. And then there's even a few plants that don't need a lot of water, but you can tuck them right down in and they will still be just fine when it does water. So this is kind of kind of typical of how we might draw inspiration. So you can see here, here's the riparian area. This is in San Diego County. But then as soon as you get away from it, it's still the kind of drier adapted plants. And so that's, something that can help provide also a visual as well as a functional in terms of capturing water when it comes off of our roofs or a driveway, kind of guiding principle in our yards. And here is just an example of that when I was working at the Huntington, of a native riparian kind of simplified space that I designed outside of one of the art galleries there. And so this kind of sets things up for thinking about using plant communities as a basis for design. So there's kind of two approaches. The first one is to decide on a concept or a feel you want to achieve and to match that to an actual plant community that grows somewhere near where you live. And then you can figure out the best plants to meet your goals. If in our local plant communities, there'll be a bunch of plants that are going to be perfectly easy to grow at home and some that you'll never find in the nursery and might be hard to grow at home. And so kind of go towards those easier ones, figure out that look and feel that you want. So for example, when I did my front yard, I wanted it to feel kind of like over time, kind of like an oasis, a kind of respite area, and to provide some more privacy for the house because it felt really open. We'll look at my front yard as a case study later. And so I decided oak woodland and kind of the open spaces at the edge of an oak woodland would be the concept and feel. Turns out I didn't have the right space for the oak tree in my front yard, but I used some of the large shrubs, small trees that might grow near those spaces to get that concept or feel. Or you can fall in love with plants and design them into the right spaces. And you're kind of going to be creating your own custom plant community. But by understanding the idea of plant communities, that there's plants that grow well together because they've evolved and they have the same needs for sun or shade, the same amount of moisture, they do well in the soils. You kind of look at the patterns of how plants grow together in the real world. And then you make it look nice for a garden using the plants that you select, using this principle of making sure you put the right plant in the right place. We'll talk a lot about that more later. That's a way to kind of create your own custom plant community. That's what my partner and I do in our backyard. And we have plants near each other that are sometimes from the desert, as well as from the local chaparral, as well as from like the Channel Islands. And we're creating our own plant community, but it holds together because we are using these right plant, right place ideas. And we can assemble resilient, coherent landscapes by using this concept of plant communities. And if you want to, it could be all local native species. And I'll show you a resource for figuring that out later on. I've seen amazing gardens that really just focus on local native species. Or it can be that any combination of plants that have similar needs in your garden. So here is one quick example. This is a picnic area that I designed at the Huntington when we were redoing the entrance. And this is February 2015. This was going to be an oak woodland, and we actually had the space to plant a bunch of oak trees. And you can see the oak trees had been planted. Normally, I plant all trees from small, like a 1-gallon pot, or for trees, you might do a 5-gallon, or even if you can only find it, a 15-gallon. These, because there was a specific donor and it was a public space, came in as large 3-foot boxes, which I would never recommend for a home garden. And even still with the large boxes, once you get them in the garden, they don't look that big. And in a couple of years, the small ones are going to grow faster and everything will be the same size anyway. So always plant small. And so what we did is we designed a planting. This is an area with a lot of smaller grasses. So there's a lot of plants here. In some areas, they were spaced farther apart, of plants that would grow right on the edges of a local oak woodland, because we're not going to have that shade canopy quite yet. And so we're growing plants that could take more full sun, but would grow kind of in combination with it. Mostly local native plants, but not exclusively, other shrubs, grasses, and perennials. And then the ones we planted closest to the oak trees were ones that are going to be able to take the transition to some shade in the first few years as the oaks grow in. And so this was February, and this is August of the same year. So most of these native plants really do get going and growing before too long if they're treated appropriately and taken care of well during establishment. And you can see some will grow quicker, some will grow faster. So Toyon, which is not a slow growing plant, but in the first year can take a little while to get going. is growing a little slower than our sages and our buckwheats and our sagebrushes, but we gave it some appropriate space so it doesn't get immediately overrun. And so you can see here the oak trees, white sage, and California sagebrush, which commonly you would find in the sun, kind of close to oak trees. And some of the other native shrubs as well, like sugarbush, which is one of the plants that we saw on the little walkthrough I took you on of our local riparian area. Narrowleaf milkweed, popped it in there. First year, monarch butterflies. And then working with some close relatives. So for example, there is a native aster that grows kind of here and there, kind of all over the place, but there's a specific selection of it for the garden called silver carpet, which is just a little bit cleaner looking. It's California native, but it's not a local native, but we put it here instead because it just makes a much nicer presentation. Even if you know what you're doing and you're spending your time on it, if you put a whole garden of plants in the ground, you'll always lose a few. So this one, this was the right plant in the right place, but sometimes you lose one. So just make sure that however you water it, it's getting the appropriate establishment water. Most native plants in most gardens are going to want to deep water about once a week the first year, and then starting to taper off. And then it's a chance to either try the same plant again or plant something else. If you try the same plant again and it dies again, probably plant something else. And I love working with native grasses as well. So much beauty. And so again, this is like 6 months in. Depending on your soils and your conditions, they may or may not grow as quickly. This happened to be great kind of sandy, silty loam soil that the native plants really respond well to. And heavier clay soil, it might take a little bit longer for things to get going. And so that's just one example. When you are starting to think about the concept for your space, in addition to thinking about plant communities, whether it's your own or you're copying a local one, also consider creating a story or a concept for your garden. This is something that Mike Evans, who is one of the owners of Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano, an absolutely incredible, mostly native plant nursery that you should all go visit if you've not been there before and you're interested and in the area. He is really big on creating a story or even a narrative for your garden. So I sort of took this inspiration from him. Just want to give credit where credit is due. So having a concept or even a small narrative, or if it's like a poem or a collage, something that really kind of provides you a guiding light to make decisions for your space can be a very powerful tool. You might figure out what that concept is before you get started and tailor everything to it, or you might kind of get started and realize what that concept is over time. So, for example, in my yard, our front yard is a native woodland, or kind of will be as things grow in. That we knew from the beginning and kind of designed it as such. Our house now functions as a bird blind for us to look out all of our windows and observe all the wildlife. We didn't realize that that's what we were trying to do at first, but as we evolved that concept, we started doing things like putting some large branches dug into the ground securely and sticking up so they would be perches. So this is I'm actually teaching this from home today because the internet at our office is out. This is outside the window that I'm sitting at right now. And as a bird blind, when we're sitting here between the plants and the perches and where we angle the bird baths, we have set things up specifically for that. That kind of evolved. And our backyard completely evolved. My partner and I are both professional horticulturists. So our backyard, our front yard, we did a traditional landscape design. Our backyard, we've kind of just built like a sculpture and a collage a little bit at a time as we've had interesting plants. And it's evolved into part native plant collection, part orchard with California native plant meadow underneath, part vegetable garden, as well as other little kind of meadow areas. So we have a dry stream bed that's kind of evolved into a semi-desert riparian area. We have another area that's kind of more chaparral. We also happen to have a large backyard. It's why we bought the property in the first place. So those are just kind of different stories. Your story might be very different. Your story might include a meditation garden. Your story might include a great place for family and friends in the shade of native trees that provide nesting spaces for birds. Whatever it is, whatever is going to help provide the best space for you. And then remember, if gardens are also habitat for people, they need space for people. So you might have a section of your yard that's super dense and all about the wildlife, but in general, gardens need an entrance, whether it's to enjoy a patio space or whether it's to walk around and do your garden care. Paths and other features can also help define the planted areas, and especially in kind of a wild and woolly front yard garden that might be like the first one to go in your neighborhood. What you do with the pathways or other features can really help show it off as an intentional and cultivated space. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So let's check in on any questions. Okay, just a couple of very specific questions that we can answer at the end. So we can keep going for now. And then about halfway through the workshop, we'll also take a quick 5-minute break so people can use the restroom, grab a drink of water, anything like that. So briefly, before we go on, we're going to start talking about those basic elements of landscape design. But we're going to show a lot of pictures. And so I want to give some credit to the Theodore Payne Foundation, because they have very generously allowed me in my presentations to use photography from their garden tour, a mix of photographs I've taken when I'm on their garden tour, as well as some that are actually their promotional photographs for the garden tour. So that allows me to show you all more examples than I would be able to do otherwise. Theodore Payne Foundation is a nonprofit based in the San Fernando Valley, Sun Valley area, but active throughout much of the Los Angeles area of Southern California. And they are essentially dedicated to the conservation and promotion of California native plants. And so not everything, but a lot of what they do happens to deal with urban gardening and horticulture. They have an incredible plant nursery that's open year round. And the pictures that you are going to see are from their garden tour, which happens every spring. They had to shift it to be online the past couple of years, but this year it is back in person again. And so every year in April, over one Saturday and Sunday, they coordinate having gardens in many different communities in the Los Angeles area open for the public to visit. You get to see all sorts of different garden designs. You get to talk to both knowledgeable volunteers as well as the homeowners in those gardens and ask them about the process. Some of them are designed by the homeowners and installed by the homeowners. Some of them are kind of high end and done by contractors. Occasionally the contractors are there as well. Lots of great stuff. And so if you go to the website for the Native Plant Garden Tour, which is a separate website, nativeplantgardentour.org, not only can you find the information and sign up if you want, but they have an archive of all of the past years of the garden tour. And you can go house by house and look at the different garden styles and all the different things going on. So it's a really great resource for inspiration if you're thinking about your design project as well, partially for the plants, but also partially to see what they do with pathways, patios, social spaces, all that sort of stuff. And so now we're going to go through those basic elements of landscape design. So something that oftentimes I encourage people to think about before, again, you get into thinking about plants or planting, is to think about landform. And that's essentially to think about what the soil is doing. Is it flat? Is it sloped? Are you going to make changes? Do you need to dig an area for the rainwater to soak in with that extra soil coming out? What do you want to do with it? Do you want to build some mounds to get better drainage if you don't have great draining soil? So this is an example of my backyard in progress, where we had a lot of issues with water accumulation in the front, and we created a system that sends water down the side of the yard and into a series of little dry stream beds with which one would kind of looks continual, but one space would fill up, pour into the next, and eventually in a large rain event, flood this little sunken meadow area with a native grass-like plant, Western meadow sedge, that can take seasonal flooding, but doesn't need much water in the warm season. And with all of that soil coming out, we decided to take this area that was gently sloped, but too sloped to be very useful as a social space. We built a small separate patio area, plants that are now growing in between these two different spaces. So we have our outdoor dining area, we flattened this area, patio area, and then we used also that soil to create a flatter than it would have been few terraces for little planting zones, as well as the space to then retain and have this kind of broken concrete bench. All of this is concrete reused from breaking up parts of this patio that were in bad shape, and this patio is too large. And then you can't see it here, but there's some trees that were later planted, which are starting to provide shade for this area. So kind of thinking about using landform. Here's another example of capturing that water while providing interest. So this area here, dry stream bed, was dug out, and that soil that came out was then used to create a mound on the street side. So that created more visual interest in terms of the topography, also created in this very kind of narrow side yard, a little bit more sense of privacy on this kind of busy for residential side street sort of street. And you can see really nice example of plants up against the house, some layering, access pathway, the rainwater feature, which looks lovely as well, using different sizes of local stone, and then the mound and landform for the plants on the other side. So that's landform. That's a very brief introduction. If you are interested in learning more about landform, how to set up dry stream beds and all of that, once a year in the rainier season, I teach a class called Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes, but there is a recording of that on our YouTube page, Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes. If you joined us after the very beginning, you can access our YouTube page by going to cbwcd.org/YouTube, which is the very first thing I put in the chat at the beginning of the workshop, so you can scroll up and get that link. So moving on, other important things to understand are what's called exposure, which is the amount of sun and shade, and microclimates. So exposure, basically in terms of garden needs, you need to understand it if your area is full sun or part shade, or shade. Full sun doesn't necessarily need to mean full blasting sun all day, sun up to sundown. There's actually a definition for full sun in terms of plants and horticulture. That's 6 or more hours of direct sunlight throughout most of the year. So in a lot of our yards, you might still have an area like that's on the up against the east side of your house that gets sun from sun up until midday, and then is shaded in the afternoon. That can still very well be full sun. Part sun is generally defined as less than 6 hours of direct sunlight throughout most of the year, or underneath like a high canopy of dappled shade. And full shade is really like underneath a tree canopy or an overhang and doesn't get any direct sun. And then microclimates are any particularly hot or cold areas in your yard. So for example, everyone in your neighborhood might have the same general climate, but on your yard, there are going to be areas that are hotter and colder. So in inland Southern California, especially western facing areas that are in full sun, especially if they're near paving or driveways or walls, those plants really need to be able to take the heat. In the afternoon, it's going to be much hotter there than it is on the interior of your yard. And so oftentimes I will end up using desert plants, even if it's not in the desert area, in some of those west-facing reflected heat areas, because they are very hot microclimates. And a lot of our desert plants can take all of that heat in the summer and just turn it into more flowers, where sometimes, especially if there's a lot of asphalt or concrete nearby, even some of our local native plants, like they'll do all right, but they might not really thrive with that extra heat. All depends on the situation, and you'll kind of learn that over time. Another microclimate might be a cooler or moister area that you have. And so, for example, this is a water feature built out of a galvanized trough in our backyard. And because it is on the north side of, when we moved here, already a very tall established grapefruit, it stays shady throughout most of the year. We have this water feature, which doesn't use a lot of water, but there's just a tiny little bit of splash from the recirculating water. And it gets a little bit of spray from the irrigation system that's watering the fruit trees. And so this is a cooler and moister microclimate where we grow some plants that wouldn't be happy even in just the full sun in the middle of our garden. So that's another example. And now we're going to start getting into some of the visual aspects of planting design and working with plants. So like I mentioned before, we might be working with native plants, but we still might want to have the look of a cultivated garden, or maybe some mix of kind of wild and cultivated. So here are some kind of landscape design concepts that can really help you out with that as you do start to think about your planting. Repetition. So here, this garden from the Theodore Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, I think here is a classic example of repetition. So it's a kind of beautiful but kind of wild looking front yard. And here with this sulfur buckwheat, you can see the repetition of this 1, 2, 3. That's a classic kind of formal garden design element, which also gives the viewer a clue that this is an intentionally designed garden. So that's kind of nice and can be useful. Massing is working with repetition of an individual plant for an aesthetic or sometimes even ecological effect. And so here, this is a planting design that I did where there was already an established tree, and this was an entrance area, a lot of people walking by. And so working with this native deer grass in a large mass was mostly what fit the bill aesthetically. It's quite striking. And then interspersed here and there were some native sages and buckwheats to provide some seasonal pops of color. And then at a certain point in time, they are kind of cut back and they almost disappear, but you can just see the deer grass still kind of holding that together. Now, in a residential yard, you might not do a mass this big. That could be your whole front yard, could be a deer grass meadow with pops of color from native sages and buckwheats and maybe some penstemons. But you can also think about massing on a smaller scale. So, for example, you'll see later on the corner of my front yard, which has maybe 7 deer grass and some things interspersed as a mass. It doesn't need to be quite as big, or you might work with 3s or 5s of something like that. A little pop of surprise every here and there adds a really nice element of interest or detail to your garden. So this is just one example of this is that rock and broken concrete wall that you saw in my yard. And my partner tucked in some Dudleyias, one of the California native succulents that grow in a variety of different plant communities. And it's just this nice little thing you notice every once in a while. It's kind of small moment of beauty. It doesn't need to all be kind of large, grand gestures. And just one of them. Texture is really important when you think about the aesthetics of designing. Flowers come and go throughout the year. And we'll talk a little bit about color later on, but most plants are not going to be in flower year round. But the visual aspects of the leaves of the plants are going to be there year round. And so working with texture and leaf color as well, aesthetically, is in fact more powerful than really thinking about for aesthetics necessarily working with flower color. To me, that's kind of a lower level of priority. And so by texture, I mean kind of what you see going on with the leaf. So here in the front, we have yarrow with a small ferny leaf. And so that is kind of even more pronounced, and the beauty of that becomes more defined when it's in front of this hummingbird sage, which has the large triangular leaf. And then both of those kind of become more pronounced when they're next to the deer grass, which has a very different form and leaf. And then there's the billowiness of the showy penstemon here. And so the contrast between all of these help make each one look a little bit more distinct. So that's kind of at the smaller scale. And then when we zoom out some, these are all pictures from my front yard. Along the edge of it, the kind of gauziness of the native grasses at certain times of the year is kind of the defining element of the edge of the texture. So we have deer grass in the back, we have alkali saccaton in the front, which has this really kind of lacy flower. And then we have the contrast of the colorful perennials and then the larger shrubs in the background. And so the texture is about kind of that gauzy, kind of ethereal look, which just looks incredibly beautiful when it's backlit in the morning or the evening, which is often when I see it when I'm heading out to or coming home from work. And then like I just mentioned, color, the leaf color is actually more important to me aesthetically on the day-to-day basis than the flower color, because again, flowers come and go. But in leaf color, we have so many almost light or white or silvery leaves within California native plants, and then plenty of dark leaved plants or traditional greens as well. And so here you can see in the front, kind of out of focus, the almost white leaf of Desperado sage, and how that contrasts with right behind it, the California bush sunflower, which is a more traditional green. And so when you group sometimes aesthetically too many of the light colored plants together, you sort of lose some of the impact of that lovely silver foliage. And so having some of the darker colored plants in the mix helps everything look better. And then my take on color is only worry about it if you want to. I'm a fan of planting plants based on the plant community, based on the kind of everyday beauty. And then I just let the colors do their thing. It's kind of a riot of colors. I make sure that my garden for the habitat focuses has plants blooming year round, summer, fall, winter, spring. But then the flower colors just kind of work themselves out. And so whether you see here, which is a combination of shrubs, perennials, as well as the annual wildflowers like the California poppies and the pink clarkias, or in the front yard, where as the colors work themselves out, it's purple against purple. And so some people might think, well, purple plants next to purple plants, there's not enough contrast. But when you actually look at it, the colors of these two of my favorite native perennials, they're both purple, but there's really something striking and different going on in each of them. And they look amazing together to me. So I don't worry about color, that much. I accept all of the colors and they work themselves out. And in most cases, some people are great with color. To be honest, I am not. And I think when they work themselves out most of the time, they do that better than I would have planned it. And especially for me, like there's enough to worry about. Putting the right plant in the right place, thinking about what's going to grow well together in terms of the shade, the water, all the habitat stuff I'm interested in, the kind of foliage and texture. I just let the color work itself out, and it does. And then going from kind of the aesthetics to a more kind of nuts and bolts important thing to consider, which is a concept called hydrozone, which kind of sounds intimidating, but don't let it be. Basically, it means you group plants with similar moisture needs together. So if you have plants that only want water once a month, and some plants that want water twice a week, and some plants that need water every week because they're high water using plants, you don't just jumble them all together, because then how do you provide the specific needs for each plant to keep it optimally happy and healthy and not have to be overwatering the low water plants to keep the high water plants high? And so I really like this picture that I took of a front yard garden in Pasadena. This, I would imagine, is probably someone maybe from the Northeast or the Northwest that has probably an emotional connection with Japanese maple and hydrangea because they wanted to grow them here. But how they did it is very appropriate. This is in between the houses, almost in kind of a shady part of the yard, where those two high water use plants are right next to each other. They probably don't even need a different zone of their irrigation system. They might just hose water these two high water use plants. And then the rest of the yard is a combination of low water demanding California native, as well as some other Mediterranean climate plants. And the rest of this yard can probably all get watered every other week after establishment, and everything will be fine. It's going to be a little bit more water than some of them need, but not too much. So pretty appropriate overall. Here is another example of a front yard landscape. And here we have a combination of a lot of California native plants, some younger, some older here, as well as some fruit trees, a couple of citrus trees and a pomegranate tree. And so even though those aren't the highest water using fruit trees, they still are either on the low end of high water using plants, or to get, for example, from the pomegranate, you cannot water it at all and it'll live probably, but you're not going to get great fruit production. So those are going to be watered generally once a week, but the rest of the landscape could be watered. This is west facing, hot reflected heat in Van Nuys, every 3 weeks, maybe a little bit less often, not in the peak of summer. And so how do you do that with them all mixed in? Well, this is working with drip irrigation, which in some cases is a good way to go. It's not always the only way to go, but because those drip irrigation areas are buried, how we set this up is the general landscape area gets watered with one valve, actually two. The parkway area has a valve. The general landscape in the center area has a valve. And then there's a separate valve that just has some extra loops of drip irrigation spiraling around each of the fruit trees. And so they can get water once a week. The rest of the landscape can get water more often. So it's still hydrozone, but by working with drip irrigation, because there's no sprinkler overspray, you can do a targeted smaller area and make it all work. And so thinking as well about plant density, that's always something that's a little bit hard to gauge for beginning gardeners, is how close do I put the plants together? How much open space do I want versus how much kind of really plants rubbing elbows together do I want? In general, don't be afraid to plant plants to fully grow in. Now, definitely do your research. And especially if you live in our local area, inland Southern California, when you look up how big a plant is going to get, it will usually get at least that big, sometimes bigger. This inland heat grows plants large, especially if you are in a valley bottom area where we have those pretty good alluvial soils, those old agricultural areas. There's a reason why they wanted to grow their trees here. It's pretty good soil generally. Once, for example, here we would get the turf out and sometimes maybe relieve some soil compaction. And so in general, you're going to want to let things grow in. You're going to want to leave yourself access for your pathways. Maybe, leave your area for your social spaces. Here, this is a relatively busy street. So they left some spaces with using decomposed granite on the parkways so people could park their cars and walk through, because they probably would have walked through the landscape anyway. So this is a very appropriate area to be lower plant density. But in the main garden, plant density is generally a good thing. If you just have wide open areas, what's going to happen is that weeds are going to grow there over time usually. And so you might as well have plants that are going to, after they're established, kind of tend to shade out the soil, outcompete the weeds, and look lovely against each other. And there's some nice layering here with the smaller plants at the edge, lower plants building up to a larger size. So the combination of native and low water plants. Here is another view into that landscape from around the corner. And here's just a completely separate landscape where you can see the high planting density. This is a landscape in Pasadena of native plants, but then areas that are maintained open to be able to easily walk through. You don't have to go through your yard with a machete and enjoy the patio spaces in this front yard. Again, another instance of people planting these multi-level gardens that have a lot of beauty, provide a little bit more privacy near the house, and then people want to spend time in these patio spaces in their front yard. Here is, I used to live in Altadena, so I have a lot of pictures from that area, but Altadena, Pasadena, very similar to our more inland areas as well. And here is a very high plant density, mostly native, but also some Mediterranean. It's a good mix front yard with some annual wildflowers. So pretty high plant density, but then the open spaces in between have some annual California poppies that at least in the spring are filling it in. Absolutely lovely. But if you don't like that much planting density, that's just fine. Here's a garden that was designed by Tim Becker. He's the director of horticulture at the Theodore Payne Foundation. A combination of native plants and fruit trees as well. It's kind of popular combination. And here I will say that a lot of these plants are small and will grow into have higher plant density. But if you're looking for a lower plant density garden with a little bit more open space, I think this garden space is a really nice guideline to where you can see it's the open spaces aren't just kind of not thought about, abandoned or neglected, but there's a little bit of thought going, or probably a lot of thought going on here, but you can see the contours of the landscape, the rocks that are mixed in, whether it's cobblestone or large boulders. And if you can't physically get the large boulders in there, no problem at all. But working with a combination of stone and mulch and some annual wildflowers seasonally in the open spaces, and then kind of framing the kind of larger, more permanent plantings. If you do want to go with a kind of very low plant density area, that's just fine. This is a yard in Pomona, and this is actually not a native plant front yard, but I think it's a good example of the concept. Trees and shade, I think, are the key to making low plant density work well. Like if this just big mulch area was here without these two pineapple guava trees, it would just look like the garden wasn't done. But with the shade, just kind of mulch and stone and a couple of plants here there underneath is pretty natural. And that's like you would see in some kind of native oak woodland areas. If there's a density of shade, sometimes with the accumulation of the leaf litter, there's only plants kind of growing here or there. So that's a way to kind of make it work. Here's another example, trees and the nice kind of stone edging. And then there's some plantings here or there, but again, not super high plant density. And then other areas that are more open that have a higher plant density. And so this is really to transition to talking about another concept, which is trees. Trees are super important, especially if you are in a hot inland area. A lot of the year, it's really too hot to enjoy the outside much of the day and even into the evening if we don't have some shade or protection of those spaces. And trees are a great way to do it. If you have room for a big oak tree or even a sycamore tree, if you're up for picking up the leaves after it gets large, or just kind of raking them here and there as you want, then go for it, especially an oak tree. If you have room for an oak tree, plant one. But even if you don't, there are a lot of smaller trees. So this one here on the left, Catalina Island Cherry, is also one of my favorites. It's going to be 10, maybe 15 feet wide, but it gets taller, 20, maybe 25 feet. So a nice kind of smaller tree. It's not something that you'll have to hire people to climb way up into to do intricate tree pruning over time, but perfect to put on the west side of a patio or social space to provide some shade in the afternoon so you can actually enjoy the space outside. A lot of people are worried about trees destroying their pavement or destroying their sewer line. So here are important things to know about trees. If your sewer line is not leaking, the roots will not break the sewer line. Oftentimes those problems are older houses that have never had the sewer line replaced. And so a lot of Southern California are kind of 1940s, 1950s tract homes. And so if that is the original sewer line, there is a good chance that by now it leaks. I grew up in one of those homes. The sewer line had some small cracks in it, and any sort of tree was always going to be growing into it. And we had that problem in my yard. Eventually, when those sewer lines are replaced with a modern line that is properly sealed up and there are no leaks, there's no incentive for the tree to really be trying to break into it, and chances are it will be fine. Now, you want to know where it is, because if you plant an oak tree, you don't want to physically put that long-term weight right on top of it, but it shouldn't be breaking your sewer line. And then with pavement, a large part of the issues with trees breaking pavement is either one, being right up against the edge and being a large tree. So again, if you have an oak, I would plant it at least 6 feet away from a sidewalk. If you put a tree that's going to have a huge root ball and a huge root crown over time right up against the sidewalk or a paved patio space, it will lift it over time. But even for smaller trees, a lot of those issues are because those trees had been growing in lawns. And when people water lawns, they water 3-4 times a week, hopefully not more than that. And they're only watering about 3 inches deep. And so all the roots of even a small tree are going to want to be at the surface in those conditions. But when we're talking about native plants that after establishment are going to be getting watered every 3-4 weeks, maybe even less often, and watering them deeply through the whole root zone of the plant, we're training our roots to go down deep where the soil is going to stay cooler, where the soil is going to stay a little bit moister, and you're going to have fewer problems with roots being right at the surface in most cases. Here's another local example from Pomona, a street in the Lincoln Park area, where as kind of street trees pruned up, because Western redbud trees are really, they're shrubs that you can turn into trees. They sell them as single trunk trees, but they don't grow well as single trunk trees for long. They always kind of want to become a multi-trunk tree. So generally I say just accept it. But on a hot day, walking underneath this row of Western redbud trees is just incredibly beautiful and very cooling. And there's also an aesthetic difference that's made. So here is a house in Claremont where they went with a pretty simple, low planting density low plant diversity approach, which is just fine. So there's a few main plants here, and they're all great plants for the space. Santa Cruz Island buckwheat, one of my favorites. Pigeon Point coyote brush, a great green, low maintenance, tough as nails way to cover a space with kind of a knee-high green carpet. Eventually it might get taller. You can kind of easily keep it there. So you can see all that repetition that we talked about, massing and repetition can be very effective. And then some pops of color here with the Allen Chickering sage, which will have beautiful purple flowers. But then also this tree, this Catalpa tree, which is a hybrid, partially of native parentage, but you can find it often at native plant nurseries. And this tree just makes such a difference, both for providing some shade to the house, for providing some privacy to the house, and providing some structure to the landscape. This landscape, with the repetition, how it is, just wouldn't be the same without that tree, which makes a huge difference. And I'm really a fan of this kind of simple, easy to maintain landscape. And the shade underneath, especially a coast live oak, is just an incredible microclimate. It's the place to be in a hot area outside in the summer. We have a much smaller coast live oak than this in our yard, and it is incredible, the difference. It can be a hot day where you don't even want to be outside, and then perfectly pleasant sitting underneath the shade of the oak tree. This happens to be one of the plants in Southern California that needs shade. Evergreen currant is a great, easy, low ground cover, but will fry if it gets any direct sunlight. So one of the best things underneath the shade of an oak tree. And then thinking about patio scale trees. So here, this is a Desert Museum Palo Verde tree. Beautiful tree, becoming very common in landscape at the California Botanic Garden. I will say, though, that this tree did start to lift some of the pavement, I believe because there's such a small area to be able to water and to be able to give it a deep soak that its roots were probably looking for water. So in a residential yard, I would maybe do this on a patio space, but have it be a gravel or like a decomposed granite patio, which we will look at in just a little bit, those material options, so that there'd be a way to water it more evenly and not pavement slabs to really get pushed up if it does need to do that. Here's just another picture of a beautiful coast live oak in a very naturalistic, and this happens to be a local native residential garden. And another reason to plant trees is that they're very important to more than just us humans. Trees are where birds roost, where they seek respite, where they go back to when they get startled, if they are foraging in your garden for seeds or fruit, and that's where they nest. And so here are just a few examples of the many bird species that are in the coast live oak tree in my yard. And oftentimes in the morning, there's at least 5 to 6 different species that I see darting in and out of that one, not even very old oak tree. But remember, planting trees, they take time to grow, no matter what size. So remember, it's going to be sunny all around them. And so at the beginning, it's going to be a full sun sort of area. And a great thing you might want to do if you are wanting to make sure that your plants are as long-lived or you're putting them in as possible is when you're doing your research, select plants that can take either full sun or part shade, like this California fuchsia and this red buckwheat, so that as the trees start to grow in, if they're still happy there, they can take that transition to partial shade. And then decades from now, when it becomes really shady, those plants will have to change, but it'll probably be time to make some changes in the landscape anyways. Okay, so I think we are kind of grinding through all of these concepts, and they're all very important, but I'm going to stop and answer a couple of questions that came in, because that'll give us a little bit of a mental break, and then we are going to continue on with, I think we just have 1 or 2 more concepts, and then we will move on to kind of starting to think about how to apply those concepts. So, question from Astrid. How do you find out where the sewer line is before planting trees? Okay, great question. In the vast majority of homes, there will be a direct line between the water meter, which is in a usually concrete box in the front yard, which is where they read how much water you've used. And usually that will be in a straight line with seeing a pipe, a little bit of a pipe come up out of the ground and directly into your house. Oftentimes there'll be a hose bib as well there. And that is usually where that main line is actually going into your house to then provide the water inside. In the vast majority of cases, I I'm talking about the water main line. I'm not talking about the sewer line. Sewer line is a different issue. Sorry about that. Water main is another one that's not as problematic because it's pressurized and usually doesn't leak as much, but sometimes people want to know, especially if they're doing a dry stream bed. Sewer line is actually quite a bit more complicated. You might get in touch with the city and see if they have any indicator to find out. The other thing that you can do is you or somebody you know who is handy or fits, if you crawl around underneath the house, if your house is on a raised foundation, you can kind of see sometimes where the plumbing drain lines join together and where they sort of head out from underneath the house. And in general, that's going to be like where it starts heading out is going to be a straight line to where the sewer line links up. Before you do any significant digging in your yard, and this is not just planting a couple of trees, but definitely if you're doing dry stream beds, running irrigation lines, you can call, Paul just put it in the chat, you can call a free service, and you actually are supposed to by law call a free service called Dig Alert, which is you can just dial 811 and set up the appointment, or if you go to Dig Alert online, you can set that up. And within 72 hours, they will respond and they will mark any utilities in your area of your project. However, that is utilities on the utility end. So example, sewer main, which is often out in the street, they would mark. The gas line, they will often mark because the gas meter is actually usually on your property in the house. If your electrical is buried, they will often mark that. However, you might not get sewer line and you often won't get your water main line. They might be able to advise you, but those are your property and your responsibility. So they do not necessarily need to mark those. But sometimes them marking where the main sort of is gives you kind of the logical answer in terms of how your property connects to it. And sometimes they've just seen so many houses that they know how things tend to run. So if you can meet them there, you can sometimes ask them questions and they can help you figure out stuff. It's completely free. And then in different other communities for people joining us from other areas, there are usually a similar service. So that's some tips about that. Someone asked what the name of the San Juan Capistrano nursery is. That's Tree of Life Nursery. And they also do classes, they have demonstration plantings, all sorts of stuff. George asked a question about maintaining a Toyon as a single trunk tree. Just like the Western Redbud that I mentioned, it doesn't really want to be a single trunk tree. It wants to be multi-trunk. Some of these, you can buy them at nurseries. They've trained them, but as soon as you get them out into the landscape, that's really not what they want to do. So like you were thinking, George, in your question, I would never try to maintain Toyon as a single trunk tree. It's going to want to lean over time. And then while we're talking about utilities, are utilities buried at a standard depth? To code, they are supposed to be, but what I run into in the real world is that often they are more shallow. So it probably depends if it's like brand new construction that's been inspected and there hasn't been kind of piecemeal corrective work over time when there've been problems, then possibly, but I never take anything for granted. So for example, in my front yard, I found out that when my water line, my main water line was replaced, it was only about 6 inches deep. Absolutely not to code. But it's what I inherited when I bought the place and started working on my landscape. And so, yeah, I always, if there might be a utility line nearby, I always look. And then if the Dig Alert person is coming out, they might be able to advise you. But again, I always, if I'm going to be digging anywhere in the area where I know there's a line, I dig very carefully until I find exactly where it is or stay on top of it. Okay. So with that, why don't we, it's 10:40. Why don't we take our 5-minute break? We'll start back again at 10:45. We'll go through the last of our design principles. We'll talk about, with those principles, then, the selecting plants process. I'll show you my top couple of resources for selecting plants, and then we'll pull that all together into a detailed kind of step-by-step design example, starting with goals, going through assessing a site, and then coming up with a planting plan that's going to work for that site. And so talk to you all in 5 more minutes at 10:45. Okay, we are going to get started again. Welcome back, everybody. So this next concept is, I think, one of the more interesting things that I learned in landscape architecture school. A very useful concept, but at the end, it's something that's kind of intuitive and obvious. And this is a concept called cues to care. The concept of cues to care was developed by a woman named Joan Nassauer, who is a landscape psychologist. It's a very specific field of research. But essentially, she was an academic who did research into why people think what they do about landscapes. And she was very interested in front yard restoration landscapes. Where she worked and lived, it was a very different natural plant community. It was more of a prairie style. And as front yard restoration kind of landscapes began going in communities, the reactions to them were very different. Some communities, they would go in and people would love them and really appreciate how they're contributing to the ecology and think they were beautiful. And sometimes they would go in and people would think that someone just stopped mowing the lawn and stopped caring and that it was reducing property values. And so she set up this whole study where essentially she would take similar landscapes and just kind of change one or two things in this photo visualization and ask a whole bunch of different people what they thought about them. And eventually what she found out is that regardless of what's going on with the plants or whether or not people understand the plants or specifically, know that they're native plants and valuable or anything like that, people generally like and accept landscapes that they understand are being cared for and that they are intentional. And people often will dislike landscapes that they see as neglected or abandoned or unintentional. And so even if people don't know what's going on with the plantings, that there are certain things that people can do in their yard to sort of signal to people that these are intentional and cared for spaces. And so I really love this front yard landscape. This is in Van Nuys, Southern California, hot inland climate. And I'll ask for you to think about what this landscape would look like if it wasn't for this split rail fence and these kind of little bits of stone kind of interspersed. Personally, I would still love it. I know what's going on with the plants, but my thought is that the neighbors would see it as a much more sort of disorderly kind of front yard than the fact that this exuberance of flowering shrubs and wildflowers and things kind of coming up and poking out here or there, in this case, is kind of contained by something that was intentionally put there. The little groupings of rocks in the middle of this kind of typical suburban lawn kind of neighborhood really shows that there was some like intention and artistry put to it. And then when you walk a little bit farther, you can see this decomposed granite path with the little bits of stone integrated into it here and there. This really nice kind of stone wall that then kind of splits the grade and elevates an area. And the fact that the shrubs here are actually kind of pruned so that they fall nicely along the edge and this pathway is not overgrown. These are all of these cues to the fact that even if people don't understand what's going on with the exuberance and density of the plant material, that this is an intentionally crafted space and this is a space that's maintained. And so here you can see the little kind of patio setup, which is kept nice and open. And I'm sure these people spend a lot of time in their yards and probably had all sorts of great conversations with their neighbors about what's going on in the landscape. And that's something that I found as I've torn out front yards in the past and started working on them. So I tore out a front yard and worked with people putting in a garden in the Lincoln Park Historic District neighborhood of Pomona. And these days, there's all sorts of different gardens around that neighborhood. But at that time, we were some of the first to take out the lawn on those few blocks. And people were very concerned. It's a historic neighborhood. What's it going to look like? Even before the plants went in, as soon as we started kind of roughing in the pathways and bringing in some rock and some gravel for the paths and the shapes started to come in, all of a sudden skeptical neighbors became very curious and enthusiastic and wanting to know what was going on. I met people in the neighborhood who I had never met living at that place. And it became a totally different conversation just as soon as that first cue to care that we were putting in a nicely shaped and well thought out pathway went in, regardless of what the plants were. And so now we're going to move from concepts to just a whirlwind tour of some different garden elements, things that you might have in your garden. Well, first of all, it doesn't need to be wild and naturalistic. Here's a garden that's often featured on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, probably 85% native plants, but it's kept clipped and kind of very traditional. Now that makes a lot of maintenance. There's a professional landscape company that did the work and the maintenance there. The habitat value is not quite as high because of all of the clipping and shaping and disturbance to the landscape, but certainly so much higher than if this was the traditional lawn that I'm sure it replaced. And lovely if you like a more kind of kept traditional garden aesthetic. So can be done. If you are renting and can only garden in containers, or have a lot of concrete or pavement and can only garden in containers, can be done in containers as well. And there's lots of lists available of native plants that grow well in containers, and a significant amount of wildlife will still show up to check out what's going on in your containers. Patio spaces are essential in a lot of backyard spaces, at least, if you are going to be switching to this kind of gardening. One thing about lawns is that you can kind of set them up however you want for the day. With shrubs, you can't quite do the same thing. And so thinking out where your social spaces would be, whether it's for sitting around or whether it's for eating or a combination. And the materials that work very well aesthetically with native plant gardens happen to be some of the most environmentally low impact as well as least expensive to install. So pea gravel patios work great, and then that could just kind of rake right into or move right into the mulch layer for most of these native plants. They'll grow fine with a little bit of gravel around the base. And so it can be kind of very naturalistic, and also a local product usually. Very kind of all the construction products, environmentally friendly to kind of create, and because it's local, less kind of trucking involved in movement. And then when it rains, instead of washing off and needing to be dealt with somewhere else like a concrete patio, it just, for the most part, will kind of sink in where it is, depending on your soil compaction and soil type. Some of it might wash off, but certainly it's going to be less than traditional. Also, another popular approach is a decomposed granite patio. Decomposed granite is oftentimes in like new parks that go in, or public spaces, the thing that's not quite dirt, but it's compacted. It's not quite gravel. You walk on it, and there's still kind of a satisfying crunch. That's decomposed granite, and can be used for patio spaces or pathways as well. And if you're interested in how to do that, when I show you the website later on for plants, we have some information about those sorts of projects as well. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages to them. There's no perfect in all situations material, but those are two of the top ones. And I'm really a fan of the look of decomposed granite within like a natural local river rock kind of stone edging. To me, this is just like one of the most beautiful front yards I've ever seen. On a side space, here you can see combination of true kind of paved with mortared tiles, and then kind of more naturalistic decomposed granite with rocks, keeping the plants pruned kind of up. Absolutely gorgeous. And patio and walkway spaces as well. You can see pea gravel again with stone. If you have concrete, reusing broken concrete is a very environmentally benign way of keeping the concrete out of the dump. Material can be free or very cheap often. It is quite heavy, so it definitely requires a good back and some patience to get the hang of leveling it out. There's also professional companies that do a lot of broken concrete work, and yeah, great reuse of materials, and can look quite nice as well. Here you can see this is kind of done by a professional contractor. These large pavers, these are the scale where they'd probably be formed and poured in place, but to keep it permeable, interfilled with decomposed granite, which then swoops out to become the mulch layer in this kind of very wild, rambunctious, very colorful native landscape. Here we have decomposed granite kind of going into a flagstone, but the flagstone still has the decomposed granite, sometimes called DG, between it, so it remains permeable. Or just working with simple concrete pavers available from the building supply store, or some of the very simple ones from the hardware store, just the concrete squares. And so this is a very high-end house, obviously, but all that was needed for the side walkway surrounded by beautiful plantings was to lay out those square pavers with some wood chip mulch in between. This is personally what I tend to do in my yard. Free mulch is available in many communities. If you live anywhere near us at the Waterwise Community Center, we maintain, working with a local tree trimming company that also has a green waste drop-off area that other tree trimmers drop it off at. They create a really high quality mulch product and they donate it to us. So we almost always have a huge pile in our parking lot that people can just come take what they need. And so my backyard spaces, for a variety of reasons, are just wood chip mulch, often like this. This is not my yard, but often like this with just branches, or sometimes we have broken concrete or a combination of broken concrete, stone, and branches to kind of define the edging. Price is right, and it's local and available. Our backyard has enough of a slope as well that gravel might get a little bit slippery. Wood chip mulch holds together nicely. And then thinking some about rainwater capture. We already talked just a little bit about it. And like I mentioned, the Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes online workshop is really what you want to check out, but thinking about how that integrates into your garden space. So it's not just infrastructure. These are moments that become beautiful aesthetically and then become kind of framing areas for plants. All sorts of different things that you can do with that. And then even just in your walkway spaces, considering instead of just going to concrete, something that's going to stay permeable. This is absolutely lovely. Or getting as creative as you want. So this example from a very famous native garden called the Gauntlet Native Garden, that's often on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, where with all of these native plants and attracting these butterflies and especially the songbirds, cats. I love cats. My partner and I have 4 rescue cats that live with us, but because we have this habitat yard, they stay inside the house. They get lots to look at outside, but cats, it's not their fault. They're voracious hunters of birds. And so it's kind of not fair to bring the birds to your yard and then let the cats kill them. And so people often these days build catios if they have a cat that they want to let experience the outside and do kind of native gardening. And a catio is essentially a perch connected to a window that then is surrounded by like a wire cloth so that the cat can see out. Oftentimes there's a full wood frame or like a heavy duty pet screen. So they can see out, they can get the breeze and the smells, but they can't go eat the birds. Or, in this case, they're very, very extensive cat run. Although if I let my cats out into this, I'm not sure how I would ever be able to get them home. So that is kind of the different sorts of concepts. We're going to transition now from this to talking about that plant selection part. And the reason why we talk about plant selection after concepts is because, like I said, we don't really choose our plants right at the beginning. We think about what we want for our space. And so now if we're thinking maybe, okay, in my front yard, I want my patio space. I want an outdoor dining space. I know I need a couple of trees, and then that might define room for a few shrubs. And we'll do our design example immediately after this. But now we start to think about the plants and putting the right plant in the right place. So planting design is just one part of our overall design. And so for putting plants together to do the right plant, right place thing, what you need to do is to learn and respect the plant needs, group plants with similar needs for water, sunlight, etc. Some of this is repetition, but it's because I really want you to understand this. It's critically important for success. Look up the mature size of each plant. Respect this plant that space is going to need, but don't isolate it. And so there'd be a reason to go a little bit farther or to go a little bit closer. But in general, if you're just getting started, if you research that the plant is going to be 6 feet wide, give it 6 feet to grow in. Because if you crowd it too much, that's going to require a lot more pruning, a lot more maintenance to keep the plants from kind of competing with each other. But you don't necessarily want like 5 feet of space after the plants have grown in between each one. The plants like to grow together. They like to be rubbing elbows a little bit. Layering is good. So remember, if you're going to put a tree in, think about the plants that are going to grow underneath that tree. Remember that the sun and shade is going to change. And so maybe work with plants that'll take those changes. You don't want to just put a tree that's going to be 20 feet wide one day in and have nothing within a 10-foot radius of that tree for the next 10 years. You'll just be pulling out weeds and it'll look empty and strange. And then as you go, observe and learn from what works and what doesn't. Remember, a garden is never truly done. We do all of this research and this planning to make sure that everything gets the best chance to succeed, but there's always going to be something that needs to change after some time. And so turn that into, something that's interesting. Or what's the best way to let it evolve? If something didn't live, it's not about you being a bad gardener. Sometimes things happen, and then you get to learn from that experience. I tell a lot of people, a lot of what I know about plants and why I'm confident making recommendations is because I have killed so many plants over the years doing things the wrong way, but I have learned from it. And so certain times now I'll be confident that a plant is not the best plant for a space because I tried it in a space like that and it just didn't want to grow there. So learn from what works and what doesn't. Also joining your local California Native Plant Society chapter, or going to talks at botanical gardens, visiting gardens, other workshops like this, all of those can contribute to that as well. So those major factors for assembling a successful planting. That's sun or shade. We already talked about full sun is 6 or more hours of direct sunlight, or part sun or shade. Soil drainage. Does your soil drain well or does it drain slowly? A lot of our California native plants for Southern California prefer what's called well-drained soil. So when it rains or if there's an irrigation, the soil doesn't stay wet right up where normally the sensitive spot is, where the trunk or the main stem is connecting to the roots, right where it hits the ground. That's called the root crown. That area oftentimes needs good drainage. If not, there can be rot or fungal issues. And so I will show you in just a moment how to know which plants need good drainage and which plants don't really care. But in terms of understanding if your soil has good drainage, you can kind of learn it by soil type, but the easiest thing to do for a general audience is to do a simple drainage test. Now, I don't have time in this workshop to show you like step-by-step how to do a drainage test because this is more about design, but we do have, again, an online workshop on our YouTube page called, it's something like choosing, selecting, and planting water-wise and California native plants, something like that. I'm getting the title wrong, but essentially in that, because it's really about the selection of the plants is one of the main parts of the workshop, I show you a step-by-step drainage test. It starts about 12 minutes in, so you can click through if you want. But yeah, selecting, planting, I think maybe establishing water-wise and California native plants for the garden. So definitely check that out. But essentially what you do is you dig a hole in your yard in a few places, about a foot deep and about a foot wide. Fill that hole with a hose twice, just to make sure that all of the soil around it is saturated. You only test drainage once the soil is already saturated, because if it's just super dry, you don't get true drainage test results. So fill it up with a hose once, fill it up again after it drains out. If it drains really slowly the first time, don't worry about it yet. Even well-drained soil, sometimes once it's really dry, can become what's called hydrophobic. And until it absorbs just a little bit of moisture, it's going to seem like it doesn't drain, but that can totally change as soon as that very dry hydrophobic soil gets a little of that moisture. So that's why you have to fill that hole a couple of times. The third time you fill that hole, and that might have to be the next day, third time you fill that hole, start a stopwatch and go out with a measuring tape. And what I like to do is have a yardstick, flat piece of wood, something to go across the top of the hole so that it's really easy to get a good reading with my measuring tape. And so you, after that third fill, go out every hour and write down the number of new inches that have drained out. So maybe after the first hour, it's drained 2 inches. And then if after the second hour, it's a total of 3 inches, then you only got 1 more inch. And so figure out the number of drained inches per hour and then average that out. If on average your soil is draining 2 inches per hour or more, congratulations, you have well-drained soil. You should have no problem growing the plants that require well-drained soil, as long as all the other factors work. If it's between 1 and 2 inches per hour, that's going to be medium drainage soil. And in that case, I've had plenty of projects where we plant plenty of stuff that wants well-drained soil and things do just fine. I've had some projects where in a really big rain year where there's a bunch of storms back to back, some of them sort of don't do as well. And in that case, what you might want to do is make sure you put your plants that really want well-drained soil in a medium draining kind of area, a little bit high. You can mound them up a little bit with some extra soil. Maybe if you dig your dry stream bed, you have some extra soil, and you can create some little mounds. If your drainage is 1 inch per hour or less, you have slowly draining soil. Not necessarily a problem. There's lots of California native plants that are pretty well adapted to growing in slowly draining soil. Oftentimes it's because it's a clay soil type. And so just make sure that you select plants that are adapted for clay soil. And you'll often want to plant them a little bit high as well if you have slowly draining soil. And that's just fine. And in one of the websites I'm going to show you in just a moment, you can tell it to only give you search results for plants that are adapted to clay soil. And in some ways, it might make doing your plant selection a little bit easier just because there's a less overwhelming number of plants to choose from. Remember irrigation frequency, and I'll show you some resources on that in a second. Think about the growth habit or the shape. Is your plant going to be very upright? Is it going to be low and spreading? That also has to do with size, making sure that they're not going to be too crowded, but not too far apart. And then if you really want to get into it, and some people won't want to, but if you really want to get into it, the growth rate, and sometimes you can find that information. Sometimes you'll just kind of learn about it over time. So for example, on the right, I have a picture of one of the Manzanitas in my front yard. Manzanitas are wonderful native plants. Some of them are fussy to grow. I make a couple of recommendations. One of my favorites for Southern California is Sunset, of ones that are easier, but they start growing a little bit slower than some of the other native plants. And so I really make sure that I don't crowd that one, especially because I don't want that to get overwhelmed. So just basically, you might not be able to find that information, but if you see that the plant is slower or medium growing, a lot of the plants do grow quickly. So maybe give it a little bit of extra space at the beginning to make sure that it doesn't get overwhelmed by the quick growing plants. So those are kind of those main plant factors that you want to understand. So that's a lot of information for each plant. But fortunately, there are two main websites I have to recommend for you that will provide you all or the vast majority of that information for each plant. And so I'm going to do a quick live demo now before we proceed. So, and then Mark, thank you very much, Mark, for putting into the chat. He put in the detailed drainage test, the full name of the workshop that I couldn't remember, and it's minute 12 is when it starts. So this is the Inland Valley Garden Planner. This is the website that my agency, Waterwise Community Center, created to help people in Southern California learn about and select the best plants for their garden. So this website, our goal here is to generally support the general gardener. So we don't have every single plant that a real native plant enthusiast might want to put. What we wanted to do is empower people who are just getting into it to be successful. So this contains detailed plant information for just over 350 plants that will grow well in Southern California. And about 120 of them are California natives, slightly over that, I believe. So that is what I consider to be most of the native plants that I would recommend for like the first time general gardener. There's a lot of other cool plants that I love, some stuff that I have in my yard that are not on here because they're either very rare to find them in the nursery, they're a little fussier to grow or establish, or some other reason. And so if you're just getting started, this is a really good way to keep it relatively simple. It's called the Inland Valley Garden Planner because we developed it specifically for inland Southern California, all the detailed information. However, the vast majority of these plants will grow well closer to the coast, all the way up through kind of the Bay Area. Just check locally, but there's people using it all over the Western United States for the specific plants that grow well for them. So there's lots of potential good information. Just check with local people as to whether or not those plants might work well for you before you source them and plant them. And so the center of this website is called the Plant Finder, and let's clear the search results. And so for this, if you want to say, find a, let's go with a perennial, kind of a lower ground cover plant that's California native, and it's going to be low water needs, and it's a new garden in the front yard's full blasting sun. And let's say you do have slowly draining clay soil. Well, then out of all of those plants, here's the top 9 for that situation. If instead of a perennial, now you're changing it to a shrub, it's going to be more than 9. There's 31. So there's a lot of our California native plant diversity are shrubs, especially of the things that grow well easily at home. And then say you also want it to be good for butterflies. That gets you down to our top 10 favorites. And then for each of these, you can get the basic factors for right plant, right place. So this likes all day sun. That means full sun, 6 or more direct hours. So it doesn't need to be sun up to sundown. The height, the width, each of them have its own plant profile where you can see lots of pictures of it. You can get the description. We're doing some updates right now, and for some reason the formatting changed. So normally this doesn't look as funny. It's getting worked on right now, but you can get your plant properties. So here you can double check clay soil. If you're trying to have flowering year round, you can get your flower season. Here you can see other good information. It's good on slopes and growth rate. This one grows quickly, height, width, and then you can also get the water needs. And so there are a number of different recommended irrigation schedules that we have on here. And California native plants that are low water are either irrigation schedule 1 or irrigation schedule 2. Now note that those are actually compatible. 1 are just the ones that can be really watered on the very, very low end. 2 like a little bit more. But most of the ones, if they like to be really on the low end, unless specifically in the information says don't water it at all in the summer, you can make them work together. So the most important thing is to look at the recommendations for how many times a month should you water it, and how many inches of irrigation should you give it, like basically it was raining when you do. And most of the time it's going to be 1 inch. And then the runs per month. So here you can see 1 or 2 times a month in the summer is going to be the irrigation schedule 2. Some of the other native plants for irrigation schedule 1, it'll say 1 time per summer. And so you can grow them together, just kind of growing it on the leaner side for this plant. Can tolerate more water, but it doesn't necessarily need it. I grow the vast majority of these plants at my home on the leaner side, and they do just great. But it lets you know which ones can tolerate a little bit more, where some native plants really don't want to tolerate a little bit more. They really, after establishment, won't want that twice a month. And so we try to make this as simple as possible while still giving you the most accurate information. What does it mean to run your irrigation system for 1 inch? Well, everyone's irrigation system is different. So we can't just say water for half an hour. That means nothing. But we do have other links with more information, and even walk you through step-by-step some tests you can do if you have an existing irrigation system, and then enter some of the information that you find out on the test into a calculator, which will tell you how many minutes do you run to get your 1 inch of water. If you have sprinklers, the easiest thing to do, or even if you're doing, for my backyard, parts of it, we don't have a permanent irrigation system. We just have a fan sprinkler that we attach to a hose and carefully set up so it's not overspraying. I put out a couple of jars, and when there's 1 inch of water in them or slightly more, I turn it off. So it doesn't need to be super high tech or confusing. If this is feeling intimidating to you right now, take a quick deep breath. For the vast majority of gardeners in Southern California, when you put your native plants in the ground, a good deep soaking to the depth of the root ball. So you're going to have to do some digging to figure that out once a week the first year, which is often about 1 inch. So what I'll normally do is about that inch of water once a week for the first year. Or if I'm watering with a hose, I'll make a little watering ring mound with the soil when I'm planting, and I'll fill that 2 or 3 times, 1 time per week the first year, and then tapering that off. to giving it a good deep soak every 3 to 4 weeks. That'll get you through it if you don't want to kind of do this more kind of optimized thing. This is kind of more oftentimes for people who really need to come up with a schedule and timing to enter into an irrigation controller because they have an automatic sprinkler or drip system. And then finally, each of these 350 plants also has the maintenance information. So like I mentioned, most of these plants are low maintenance, but it needs its care to stay looking best in the garden, generally once a year. But certain native plants, based on their growth and flowering cycles, prefer to get, for example, maybe a light cutback in the spring. Some of them, a harder cutback in the spring. Some of them, it's going to be in the fall. Occasionally, it's in the winter. If you sometimes cut back the plants that get cleaned up in the fall, in the spring, then you might cut off everything right before it's about to flower. It won't necessarily die. Sometimes they'll come into flower later, but it's really just not going to be optimal. Some of them, it's based on when they are going to best respond to the stress of being cut back. And so it's not rocket science, but it's a lot to learn. And there's not a lot of resources out there to pull that all together in one place. So we spent a lot of time doing that for you. For those of you who are going to be growing some other kind of rare or more interesting things, for example, like we only have a few different Manzanitas here on this website because it's the most easy ones to grow in Southern California are the ones that we recommend. But the maintenance information is going to be the same for the vast majority of the species and cultivars. So that's the plant finder. You can also create a login where you'll create a login account, password. We don't share your email with anything else. We do ask you to sign up for a newsletter, but you can opt out of doing that. And then with that, you can create your own lists. So if you're working on different concepts or ideas, you can create as many lists as you need and put different plants in and out of each list. That also allows you to do some different things like download some PDF profiles if you want to create a little binder with the information, other stuff like that. We also have other kind of generally helpful lists here. So for example, our favorite plants overall, if you just want to see all the California native plants in one place, ones that are good for hedges and screens. Some of those are native, plants for slopes. And then also if you're doing things like that dry stream bed, plants that are good next to or right down in the dry stream bed, we have lists for that. We oftentimes hear from people, especially beginning gardeners, though, that even that is kind of overwhelming. And so in response to that, what we did is we created design examples of 8 different themes, most of which focus on native plants. There are some that are non-native, like the Mediterranean garden, which is another thing that some people are interested in. But our butterfly and songbird garden, California native color garden, are all native plants. The woodland garden is all native plants. Pollinator garden is all native plants. And the meadow and colorful desert garden have significant numbers of native plants as well. Meadow garden is mostly California native plants. And so, for example, if you're interested in the songbird and butterfly garden, you go to the design, get a little description, and then we created example designs of our top plants and how to combine them. For example, front yards, extra large, large, medium, and small. And so you might look at all of them because, for example, in only the extra large garden do we actually have a patio space. But if you're working on a small backyard, you might want a patio space as well. So you might get some design ideas. And so you can see different renderings of what those plant combinations look like, get the plant identification, also have quick links to get the plant profiles for the different ones when you hover. Some different views. So this is what this one will look like from a little bit farther away. And if you prefer a little bit lower plant density, that's just fine. A lot of these with the layering, it looks very dense. But then when you actually look at the overhead view, there's a little bit more space to be able to walk in between and do some of the maintenance. And so here you can see these match exactly. They're from the same computer drafted plan, just visualized in different ways. And so if you liked some of those plant combinations, you can see how large they are and figure out the spacing, or you can literally download a whole package of these and print them on 11 by 17 paper. And you can literally use a ruler, and 1/8 of an inch will be equal to 1 foot in the real world, approximately, to kind of figure it out from there. And so then, for example, if you're trying to do that, but you have a very small space, well, you can still do that. And here's some examples of how we might go about approaching that. So that's the kind of design aspects of it. And then if you download the PDF packet, or you can search for it directly, we also have, for example, if you're thinking about putting in those pathways, figuring out decomposed granite, gravel, or how would you actually kind of construct that, we have different examples and information in construction notes about the different aspects of it. Or for example, if you are thinking about doing a dry stream bed, we have a page with details about figuring out the dry stream bed, different information about it, as well as kind of drawings about how to do that. Also much more information on that other class as well. And so a few of those different parts of it are kind of scattered here and there on the website. In the next couple of weeks, there's going to be another tab that comes up here that says resources. That's going to pull together a lot of that and have links to our online workshops and other things like that. We're working on that right now. We'll also have links to kind of the local nurseries for where to buy native plants, as well as like stone or decomposed granite or wood chip mulch or any of that sort of stuff, kind of those resources there. So that is the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. And then I very quickly also want to show you the other one. And this gets into many more plant profiles of California native plants. You can see here, that includes cultivars, I'm sure, but they have like most of the plants. Now, some of those are going to grow well in a home garden. Some of those will not. This is Calscape. It's a project of the California Native Plant Society. I use this as a reference all the time as well. And so a couple of things you can do is you can just enter your zip code. If you're interested in local native, so for example, 91763 is where the Waterwise Community Center is located. And there are 662 plants that historically were thought to be located to this general area. Now, of those, you're not going to be able to find those all at nurseries. They're not all going to grow well. However, for first-time gardeners especially, you can check out the very easy list. 83 plants. So that gives you plenty of shrubs, ground covers, perennials, trees to work with. And again, some of these will be easier to find, some of these will be harder. But what you can also do is in their advanced search, you can use their advanced search to give you easier resources. So if you want to have it local native, you can have the zip code, or you can avoid the zip code and just do the other right plant, right place factors if you're not focusing on local native plants, which you might not want to. But you can tell it, again, you want a shrub for full sun, what your drainage is, or you can just skip it if you're flexible. But if you know you have slow draining soil, you can click that. Water requirement, you can say low, very low, or extremely low, any of those. Ease of care, you can say very easy. And then availability in nurseries, so you can tell it commonly available. And then you can put in other kind of factors. Flowering season, if you're trying to find, I need one plant for winter because I don't have any winter flowering. And then you can do that. And so here you can see all those factors down to 30. White sage is a very common one. It's a great garden plant. And another cool thing is they have great habitat information, including really detailed stuff about the butterflies and moths that are hosted. Really good information. And then they also have can't find it right now. They have what nurseries generally have it available. And then also things like plant signs and plant labels if you want to print them out for your garden. So that's Calscape, super awesome website as well. So those are our top resources. And with that, let's get back to the process. Check. Okay, I don't see any. Oh, quick question about gravel that came in from Susan. We'll answer that and then we'll keep going. So does the pea gravel increase the soil temperature in full sun, and does it affect the natural composition of the soil? Good question. So gravel and soil temperature, I think there's a lot of misinformation about that. So anything that covers the soil will keep the soil temperature relatively low from the direct sun. So whether that's wood chip mulch or gravel, because it's literally just shading and not letting the sun beat down on the soil. Surface temperature is interesting with gravel versus like wood chip mulch or another covering. For a long time, I had the idea that, covering a garden with gravel is going to make things hotter. But especially if you're working with the river rock gravel, that would be like kind of the local native kind of stuff for most of Southern California. That's a lighter color. So I had a coworker who actually went out into the garden one day using one of those laser surface temperature kind of, I guess, thermometers. And she found that actually our light colored mulch was cooler on the surface than our light colored gravel mulch was cooler on the surface than our wood chip mulch, which is darker. Makes sense. It reflects the sun. However, at the end of the day, the gravel is able to hold on to more what's called thermal mass, meaning at the end of the day, after the sun starts going down, if you have no shade and it's just a huge, wide gravel open area with only a couple of plants, that area is going to remain hotter and reflect the heat that it did absorb back much later into the evening than the wood chip mulch. So that's why if people are going to use gravel as the mulch, I encourage them to also include a decent plant density and plenty of shade. And I'll oftentimes have a combination of different things. I'll do some wood chip mulch at the beginning just to get things going and inexpensively cover the soil, shade it. And then as the plants grow in, as soon as the plants grow in, they start kind of mulching themselves. And then I'll just work with some stone and gravel and branches in between. And then eventually I'll use plant cuttings just generated in the garden to refresh kind of the mulch in the beds. And I'll only bring in more wood chip mulch for the pathways. That's kind of generally my default approach. Okay, so that's choosing plants. Spend some time on those sites, and that should provide most of what you need. As long as you understand all those concepts that we talked about, the choosing plant parts with some of this information that's available is not rocket science, nor is maintaining them. If you are interested in working with all the maintenance information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, also there is a care and maintenance for native and water-wise plants online workshop on our YouTube page. And by watching that, you should be able to understand most of the concepts. So when the Inland Valley Garden Planner might say, give it a hard cutback, you'll see from that YouTube workshop, like, what does a hard cutback mean? And then you can know what plants to apply it to. And so kind of wrapping up the plant design factors, remember to tune into our seasons and understand that as part of the design. Ecologically, summer is our quiet time. And so there's plants like this young Toyon here that are going to be dark green and kind of real stately, even in the middle of the summer. And then some of our grasses, which kind of look a little bit drier, but that's part of the in and out of the seasons. And there's a beauty in that. Things like California buckwheat right here, that when the seed heads form and when the flowers fade, they turn this rust color. This is not something to be cut off. This is part of the aesthetic and something to be cherished. And that makes our gardens much more enjoyable and much less work as well. Native plants are mostly easy to grow, but require a bit of learning and just that little bit of a different approach. And yeah, we have all of those resources for you. So I'm going to go past this stop for questions because we just answered some and there are no new ones. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time to cover the design process. This is sort of how it all is coming together and the last really important critical part of this workshop. So what is happening here? I'm sorry. Some of the slides have gone out of order. I'm going to quickly fix that. I was making some tweaks to it right before the workshop. Okay, here we go. We're back in it. I'm going to present a couple of different approaches to design, and they're going to appeal to different types of people. Some people would use only one, some people use only the other, some people will use both. And this is a design for the front yard of the place that me and my partner Kira currently live in Pomona. It is a medium-sized, kind of wedge-shaped front yard because we're on a cul-de-sac, about 1,200 square feet planting area. It feels smaller because of how it's wedged and because of the number of different houses facing each other on the cul-de-sac, but it's kind of a medium-sized front yard, which feels smaller in person. So there's two things you always start with. The first thing is you always start with your goals, and literally make yourself figure out what your goals are, or you and your partner, make sure everyone who needs to be involved is involved, and write them down. So for our front yard, our goals were to have a beautiful front yard, to provide habitat specifically in the front yard for songbirds, butterflies, pollinators. We want it to be low water. Because of how the house is situated on the cul-de-sac and the fact that everyone, for the most part, just has lawns and there's some palm trees, it feels like from looking out any of the front yards in our house, which are 2 bedrooms as well as our living room, that there's about 4 different houses staring back at you. And so we wanted to increase the sense of privacy while not having it be like we just put up a big wall or a hedge all the way around and are really turning our back on the neighborhood. We wanted it to smell great, get like a whiff of some of those really lovely California native plant smells when we're walking to and from the car in the driveway, especially, or even on a hot day with the door open and just the screen door. And also, we happen to be facing north from this part of the house. And so there are some sections where we have great views of the San Gabriel Mountains. And so we wanted to, while providing that sense of privacy, also strategically leave some of those mountain views open and make sure we don't plant something too tall that's going to completely block that lovely, lovely view of the mountains in the background. Really kind of have the combination of the native plants and the mountains was really the goal in terms of what we would visually be seeing. And so those goals are all totally doable. But again, we wouldn't randomly happen upon a plant combination that's going to accomplish all those goals if we just hit the nursery and start buying things with cool looking flowers. So the next thing that you are going to do is create some sort of base plan. And depending on the kind of person you are, this can go one of 2 ways. The first example is going to be the kind of less technical, less measuring, just getting the ideas down on paper. So if you are not the kind of person to take detailed measurements and draw it all up on graph paper, this is what you will do. If you are the kind of person, or you might be willing to give that a shot, I encourage you to do that, and that will be our next example. But even before you do that, sometimes just getting your basic ideas down, you don't even need to go that far. And so here, this is just a freehand drawing that I did. I happened to do this on a tablet because I was producing it for a workshop of the front yard. I basically just pulled up on Google Maps our address, and then on the lower left corner of Google Maps, you can click to go from the map view to an aerial photograph view. If you have Apple products, Apple Maps, well, I think you can probably just log onto the webpage from anything, also has really good aerial photos. Sometimes they take them in different seasons. And so I'll often, if I'm starting to work on a project and want to get a good aerial, I'll look at both Apple Maps and Google Maps because the photography is different. And sometimes one is more clear for the space than the other one. So anyways, you do that, you zoom in to the area as much as you can. And then this one, I just kind of freehand drew based on the shapes to get it very basically. You can also print that off and trace it with tracing paper and use that to get the basics down. The most important, obvious, relevant things: driveway, planting area. Here our neighbor has a gravel strip, neighbor has a driveway. I like to mark where the doors and windows are so we can think about the views out of the house into the garden as well. We want each one of those to be lovely. Walkways, anything like that. Here, I happen to have discovered when I was doing plumbing work that our water main, like I mentioned earlier, is only 6 inches deep. So I marked that because that was going to be something that we needed to be careful of because we couldn't put any plants and definitely right on top of it, just not even room to dig them into the ground. And then also thinking about, we knew that we were going to have some sort of water harvesting feature here and needed to make sure that the pipe wasn't going to be sticking out of the ground because we're digging a dry stream bed right here. So from there, you're also going to want to evaluate your site and think about the plants and features you want to keep. Your garden doesn't need to be all or nothing with California natives. So for example, if you have a huge, beautiful magnolia tree in your yard, that's always going to be higher water than a very low California native garden. then that's just fine. You can then match that higher water tree that you want to keep with maybe some California native plants that either like or tolerate medium water use, or some other plants. And then you can have your other section. That's where you have your drier native area. There's plenty of native plants that also like the additional water. It's just not the default. So you saw those websites, you can do that research and find some really cool stuff. Site assessment, that's just a fancier word of saying noting down your observations. So do it for as long as it takes. It's often better to do a good design, or easier to do a good design, after you've lived somewhere for a year. You've seen it through all the seasons. You've observed kind of the sun and the shade. We talked about soil and drainage already. You're going to be thinking about views out of the property, whether you want to, for example, like in my front yard, we wanted to feel some more privacy. We wanted to have a less direct line of sight between our windows and our neighbors' windows, but we wanted to keep open our view to the mountains. Thinking about where water flows. Are there problems where standing water after a rain is flooding areas? We had that in our yard. Lots of standing water at the base of the house because of the slope and because of how the water comes off the roof. Those microclimates we talked about, note them down. Are there noise or other neighbor issues? If there's noise, sometimes the nice calming sound of recirculating water feature and the kind of white noise that comes from that is useful. And any existing plants, or are there really, really weedy areas? You might need to have a patch where you're just going to work on getting rid of the weeds for a whole other year, and you're going to plant another area. So thinking about all that, or anything else that's going to be relevant to your situation. Make sure to include all of the important stakeholders in your planting. So here is me at a stakeholder meeting, looking out into what was going to be the next phase of planting in our backyard. And so my kind of real loose site analysis on this base plan looked kind of like this. And part of the site analysis or site assessment going on to the base plan are to put down things that might seem completely obvious to you, but then when you get into the nitty gritty of right plant, right place, and where should I put this plant and where should I put that plant, could be very easy to forget. Oh yeah, my view of the mountains. It's like the mountains are there all the time. You think you're going to remember, but put it down on paper. I will say, as I started to think about the concept for this, we wanted a woodland feel. I was like, let's just put one huge oak tree, right here, and eventually that'll be the whole garden, and we'll get our privacy, and there'll be birds, and it'll be lovely. And then we realized, as soon as we formally kind of thought about, okay, what are really our priorities? All of them, put them down on paper. Oh my gosh, it's so obvious. In 15 years, if we're here, we will totally lose our amazing view of the mountains. And so that impacted our plan. So even if it's obvious, put it down. So when you refer back to this, you don't forget the obvious things. So here was the analysis for this. Mountain view, keep it. This area feels too open. We need some privacy. Here, because this house faces north-ish, seasonal shade, shady a lot of the year because the sun's a little bit lower in the sky. But then by the time we get to summer, blasting heat because the sun is high in the sky. There's a lot of plants that work well for that area, but you need to plan for that. In general, a couple of tips for that north side of the house, north side of the garage area. You generally will want to work with plants that can tolerate either full sun or parched shade. So that helps them transition throughout the year. One other tip as you're thinking about plants for any of these situations is I teach a class called Favorite Plants for Inland Valley Gardens, where we go through section by section, full blasting sun reflected heat, hot microclimate. Here's my favorite plants for that. Small tree. Here's my favorite plants for that. North side of the garage or the house. Here's my favorite plants for that and why. It's that not thinking about design. We talked about design here, just plant by plant by plant, all the best things about it to help you make your choices. I'm teaching that in a few weeks in this same format, or if that's not going to work for you, for the timing on the YouTube channel is the recording as well. So that helps demystify some of these different areas, especially like that north facing area. That's always kind of weird. And then we had some flooding issues when in a big rain event, we'd have like up to over an inch of water just kind of sitting here, kind of have to trudge through on the way to the driveway because we had a slope. And then our house has curved eaves, and so putting rain gutters on would be very difficult. And so the water just all comes off and comes down and would settle here. So we needed to turn that problem into a resource to harvest water for our garden and to help recharge the local groundwater. I'll show you a couple of pictures, but that and how that impacted what we did in the backyard as well for capturing water is the detailed case study on our rainwater harvesting for home landscapes workshop as well, because I had to combine a bunch of different techniques to be able to do that. And then remember, right plant, right place, sun and shade, size, soil type, and drainage. So you do your research online. A couple of other good websites to check out: Tree of Life Nursery and Las Politas Nursery, both nurseries that sell native plants, but really great information online. And especially for native gardeners, Tree of Life Nursery. I mentioned him before. Mike Evans is one of the owners, one of the guys who started the nursery, and he is just a wealth of knowledge and resources. I know a lot of what I've learned about native plants either directly from him or indirectly from things he's written. He does a monthly in your native garden type article that you can find on that website. So most months, it's this month in the natural garden. And he tells you not only what you should be thinking about to do in terms of plant care, but also some kind of observations of what's going on. And it's specific to the year. So if it's a really dry year, there's going to be information about that. If it's a wet year, there's going to be information about that, as well as he just has a really beautiful take on the experience of gardening in a native or natural garden. So it's almost a tool to enhance both your success and your enjoyment of your garden. I can't recommend it enough. That's on the Tree of Life Nursery website, and that's the monthly natural or native garden articles that Mike writes. And then also you can check out native gardens. So the largest one and closest to us is the California Botanic Garden in Claremont. Tree of Life Nursery has some native plantings. Waterwise Community Center, that's our demonstration garden. We have a number of native plantings as well. And most of these places, a lot of the plants are labeled. And then Theodore Payne Foundation, around their nursery, they have lots of native plantings as well. And in a number of these places, because they're always working on it, you'll be able to see things that are older, you'll be able to see things that are younger. So definitely check all of those out, as well as garden tours. I mentioned the Theodore Payne Foundation's one, but lots of other communities, if you're not here in Southern California, also have native garden tours, usually in the spring. Then you're going to be doing your research. So you have your general concept, you've thought about your site analysis. Then you're going to be kind of creating your plant list. You're going to fall in love with a bunch of plants. If you've gotten this far, you're probably going to find 50 different plants that you would love to have in your yard. Remember to keep it simple. Don't put in too many plants and crowd them just because you want one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. And in fact, having that jumble of one of everything is very hard both to come up with a coherent look, unless your concept is, I'm going to have my own botanical garden. And that's fine. That's part of my partner and my concept for our backyard, because we both do this, and our backyard is also sort of our laboratory. However, we have worked very, very hard. And it was not easy to create a look that holds everything together. Not something I would recommend for first timers. So in general, for the average front yard or backyard, I generally find that no more than 20 different plants total, and then there's going to be multiples of a lot of, especially the smaller ones, is generally kind of the designs I end up doing. I've been interested in this for a while. So when I do residential designs, I kind of count up the different plants at the end. Normally, it's no more than 20 for a native garden where I'm not trying to have a ton of different plants. I'm not trying to keep it super simple. Sometimes it's 12. If you really want to keep it simple, you can choose the 5 best plants. Remember that one that was the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat, the ground cover coyote brush, the one tree, and then a sage. That's a lovely front yard. You can do it with 5, no problem at all. Just really do your research. I would say try to check out those plants at a public garden or at a nursery that has demonstration plantings in person. Really make sure you like them and go from there. And in fact, for most people who are Okay, there's two types of people who are going to be in this workshop. Some are people who either already or want to self-identify as gardeners. Spending your weekends with a cup of coffee in the garden and your pruners in your hand is what gets you excited, and you want to be doing that. That's your recreation. That's your hobby. In that case, still don't do one of this and one of that, but you're going to, that diversity and that learning the needs and the maintenance of each plant appeals to you. That's great. The average person who I work with these days, though, just wants a nice garden. Maybe they're interested in native plants. They like the habitat and everything. Sometimes they're going to do the maintenance and they're just fine with that. Sometimes they are going to be having a landscaper or a gardener do that, and that's fine too, as long as you're communicating and letting them know what they need to do, because oftentimes with native plants, they won't know. So you're going to have to communicate, but they don't want to self-identify as a gardener. If that's you, keep it pretty simple, 20, 15, 12, 5 different types of plants. So do your research, then narrow your options down. And so where I'll go from that is not even necessarily choosing each plant first, but kind of feeling out the structure of the garden. So from that site assessment, and oftentimes I'll do that with tracing paper. So from that site assessment, I'll put a layer of tracing paper on top of it. So that reminds me, mountain view, feels too open, where I need to close it down, seasonal shade, all of that. And I'll start to think, okay, what does that mean? Well, because we wanted to keep our mountain view here, instead of one huge oak tree, we decided we'd have a small evergreen tree here. This is really where we wanted to kind of block the view, because this is our living room. It's also where we eat our dinner. And the view was driveway, neighbor's living room window, neighbor's driveway. And so a small evergreen tree here really creates the kind of mini backdrop. And then we have some room for layering smaller plants in front. On the corner, we still wanted some privacy, another small tree, but we decided there it could be a deciduous, maybe multi-trunk tree. So it changes throughout the season. And even when it loses its leaves, that still provides a little bit of loose screening, enough to kind of feel a little bit more privacy, but can be a little bit open. On this side, however, and this is where I'm sitting right now, if I look out this window, and in person, it's even a little bit more exaggerated. If I look out this window, what I would see when this was lawn is the neighbor's gravel strip and the cars in the driveway. And I'm perfectly fine with my neighbors, but that's not what I want to see when I'm looking out of this window, especially because the mountain view from this window is absolutely incredible. So what we decided here to do is put in an informal hedge of native plants that would actually get 8 or so feet tall to provide an evergreen backdrop for then all of these layers. And we wouldn't have to see the neighbor's gravel strip and driveway. And so creating the taller layer in the background, whether it's the tree or the hedge, then creates other opportunities. And so as you think about your space, one thing to think about from a design standpoint is, what are the most important main views? What are those views that you really want to structure, how all the plants come together? And what we realize is that even though we want our yard to be lovely from the street and for our neighbors and for the cars passing by, our social space is in the backyard, where we just have much more room. And we are never going to want a social space in the front yard that feels like 5 other houses are looking at it, and we don't have a ton of space here compared to the back. And so because of that, we don't spend a ton of time out here other than when we're working in the garden, which is perfectly lovely. And so our main views are actually more important from our windows out, and then also kind of walking out of the door first thing in the morning. It's nice to open the door and kind of be greeted by the garden on the way to my car to go into work. So that's kind of how we structured it, with the tall trees in the background. And then this created some space for some medium-sized hedges. We knew we wanted to have a bird bath where it could be seen by both of these windows for us, and as well for our cats, which like to spend time in both of these rooms. So figuring out the space for that. And then that kind of created room for a lower kind of meadowy effect that we wanted as well. And then you can see these little C's, which for us were just kind of in planning, little pops of color. So for example, on the hedge, we still wanted to kind of curve it back. And for our neighbors, because this is the area where we're literally are putting a hedge in, have a little pop of color from some small perennial plants on the corners here as well. For guests, the mailman, walking up the driveway, and as well from here from the door. So the meadow could be a little bit simpler, and then these nice kind of concentrated pops of color is what we were thinking about. Oftentimes, if you have a pathway, that'd be where those pops of color are as well. And then you start thinking about what plants go into each of those categories. And that, again, it's not even necessarily, I need 3 of these here yet, but for the individual trees, we did make those decisions. Toyon, Western Redbud. For the west edge, where we have kind of the full sun and we want those pops of color, our potential plants were penstemons, verbenas, red buckwheat, California fuchsia, hummingbird sage. We didn't end up using all of these on this western edge. For here, again, these were the right plant, right place. What are the plants that can take part shade or full sun? And then some, like the native strawberry, that really needs shade here, but we kind of knew it'd be right up against the house. But just getting that list in on that north zone, we decided we wanted a couple of shrubs here in areas that are just kind of stucco, so they won't block the view from the window. They might kind of frame it with just a branch or two. So we decided maybe a currant would be cool. There's lots of different native currants. We didn't decide which one yet. And then as we feel it out layer after layer, here we still hadn't determined all of our plants yet, but I realized, well, instead of just 3 shrubs, there's actually room for maybe 3 shrubs and some deer grass kind of filling in, kind of getting that nice textural look. And you might remember from the pictures I showed you, we ended up with some grasses over here too. So it's an evolving process. And then we decided for a meadow area, yarrow would be the main plant, kind of not how many each, but are kind of roughly our hedge species, kind of figuring that out with that research. Then after that, you can start to think of, okay, exactly how many plants go in each area. A couple of ways to do that. If you are just not the person who is going to draw this out on graph paper and do that kind of individual draw it to scale, all the circles at the right size, that's honestly the most efficient way to do it, because then you could get your plant counts, hit the nursery once, or realistically hit multiple nurseries, but you know you need 5 of this, 6 of that, 3 of this, and it'll be pretty close. A lot of people, though, will just turn off when it comes to the task of taking all the measurements and doing that. If that is you, and you want to work more intuitively, from here, I have one main suggestion, which is if you go to your local landscape and irrigation supply store, so like the specialty places that serve contractors, you can get what are called irrigation flags or marking flags, which are these little flags that come in 100 packs. And it's basically a rigid wire with a little plastic flag on it of different colors. Depending on how big your yard is, get 1 pack, get a couple packs. You can get a couple of different colors, and you can write on those with Sharpies. And so what you can do is you can kind of go to your space, either when it's still lawn or once it's cleared out, if you're doing a renovation, or oftentimes this is what I'll do if I'm just making a few changes to a garden, but I'm not going to actually like survey in and draw out where all the existing plants are. You can take those, write the names of your plants on them, stick them in the ground here and there as you're figuring it out, get out a measuring tape, measure how big that plant is going to be, figure out where the next plant is going to be, and kind of figure out your plan using those little flags, each one with the Sharpie marker label of what the plant is going to be. And then once you kind of have that relatively figured out, you can then count them all up. You can even leave them in place until the day you're going to plant if you have already done your site prep, and then that tells you where they're going to go. So that's a technique that, often I'll use if I'm just doing a small renovation of a garden. If I'm doing a full redesign, I'll definitely measure everything out. But definitely something you can do. Other things when you're working on layout is, as long as we're talking about quick layout tools, if you're working on pathways, leave a garden hose in the sun for a while, get it nice and soft, and then you can then lay out, kind of get the nice curve of your pathway, figure out exactly where you want it to be, and then use flags or wood stakes from the hardware store to mark that in. And then if you just need to kind of do some sketching where it's just like for the day, or you're figuring out, okay, this plant is going to be 8 feet wide, then I need to kind of mark that at 8 feet and then go a little bit farther. A couple of things. You can just use little stones, but also almost everyone has in their pantry an old bag of flour. And so I'll use that to just kind of sketch as well. It's if I put a stake in where my tree is going to be, and it's going to be 12 feet wide, and I want to kind of see where that canopy is going to be. I'll take my measuring tape 12 feet, I'll put a little dot of flour here and there and kind of visually start to draw that out. And then the flour will just kind of disappear into the garden over time. If you make a mistake, you can literally scratch it out like you're erasing and do something else. So that's kind of intuitive layout. If you are going to be up for drawing it out on graph paper, then here's a basic step-by-step. And this is kind of going to pull it all together. We're going to be towards noon. And what I'm going to do is I will show you, for those who want to download the slides, I include some additional resources at the end, kind of as an appendix and a reference. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so if you want to do it step-by-step with graph paper, and for those of you who come to multiple workshops, I've been saying this for months now, and I had a staff member who got an awesome new job, super happy for her, kind of backfilling a number of things that kept delaying this project. So we are almost done with finishing it's going to end up being, I think, a 12 video series on how to do this using the Inland Valley Garden Planner resources. These are screenshots from that. And so if you really want to draw it out on graph paper, here's a quick once through. And you can refer back to these slides. So I generally will start, you need to take your measurements. So I will do what I already mentioned, Google Earth, zoom in, print out, and then I'll go out to my yard with my measuring tape, easier as a two-person job, and I will take all the dimensions. Oftentimes, if you're using an aerial photo, things that you will want to capture at the base of your house that you will not be able to capture in that aerial photo are going to be where those windows are, the door and all of that. But still, the aerial photo gives you a great base to then work on. I like to use a fine tip Sharpie marker. Oftentimes I'll do pencil first, and then I'll draw over it with a Sharpie once I have all my measurements to make it easier to see. Pencil for first round, because you will do some erasing. And basically you can see it's just a process that takes time. Most people have kind of rectangular spaces, those are easier to transfer to graph paper. Here we had a weird wedge shape, and it's kind of hard to figure out the angles. In that video, I don't have time to cover it now, we'll show how to do a process called triangulation, where you can take some additional measurements and then make some little template tools out of just cutting paper to figure out exactly where those angles need to land. But you can also just approximate and still get pretty close to your plant count. And again, when you go to lay out that day, you're going to make some changes. So really, this is a process to make sure you get the right plants in the right number. Then you want to get yourself some graph paper. What I find for the average kind of 1940s or later suburban yard in inland Southern California is that 11 by 17 graph paper is going to be about the right size. So you can see here, this is 11 by 17 standard graph paper. This is my 1,200 square foot front yard. And so an 8.5 by 11 piece of graph paper, I could have each square be more than 1 foot, but it's going to take, it would take more pieces, or I like 11 by 17. It just gives you more room to work with. Your local art supply store might have it. They might not. Very easy to order online. And so depending on the size of your yard, normally you'll fit either a front yard or a backyard, and either 1/4 of an inch. So each square on standard graph paper, it's either 1/4 inch grid, or sometimes it's called 4 by 4. Each square is 1/4 of an inch. And that could either be 1 foot, or for a larger yard, 2 feet. So I was just able to fit my yard in using each square being 1 foot, transferring those measurements. If you can do that, it's a little bit easier to draw. If you can't, I've done lots of projects where 1 square on standard graph paper is 2 feet. If you want to, and you're ordering online where you have a lot of choices, is you can get what's called 8 by 8 graph paper, where each square is 1/8 of an inch, and it's already smaller for you. And that could be a guide if you have a larger yard. So you figure out what scale is going to work for you, and then you stick with it. And then you can literally use your measurements. And so here, the site assessment is the same. Here is, if you were doing it on graph paper from the beginning, here's the exact same site assessment. I was able to get a little bit more accurate because I was able to see, okay, the house is here. That's about 5 feet. That's about 10 feet. So if you're up for that, that's fine. And then here's the same process. Here you can see over the graph paper, so you keep your scale, also getting an 11 by 17 sheet of tracing paper, going through that same process, exactly, figuring out the solution in terms of the dry stream bed. Again, our rainwater harvesting class goes through that. selecting your plant using the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And after kind of doing that conceptual work, if you're working on graph paper, you can use what's called a circle template. You can order those online as well. A good art supply store will have them, one that has like drafting and architectural materials. And a circle template is for doing scaled work. So essentially you can get it's a thin piece of plastic with circles of all different sizes. Make sure that you order the one that's in inches and fractions of an inch, because they also have them in metric, which is not, centimeters is not going to work for us for this. And so what I do, for example, is, so if this is one of these squares, so 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot, then if it's a plant that's going to be 1 foot, you can see it here, I find the circle that's 1/4 of an inch. I like to find my common ones. There's going to be a lot of ones of in-between sizes that I won't use. The ones I'll use, so the 1/4 of an inch one, that's 1 foot. I put a dot with my Sharpie marker, fine tip Sharpie, and then I write 1 foot. That's going to be my 1 foot one. For the one that's 1/2 an inch, that's going to be 2 feet. I put a dot, 2 feet. For the one that's going to be 1 full inch circle, that's going to be 4 feet at my scale, 6 feet. I mark all of my common sizes. And then when I start going from my concept to fitting my actual plants in, I'm working with pencil because you're going to be doing a lot of erasing, but you can quickly, okay, on my plan, I'm going to have my deer grass. I'm going to have it be, if it's 5 feet on my plan, 5 foot circle. My hedges, if I'm going to have them be 6 foot on my plan, the different circles. And at a certain point, you're going to look at the size and it's going to be a range and you're just going to guess, but that will still help you get the right number of plants to order. Figuring out your pathways. If you want a 3 foot wide pathway, I'll sometimes, instead of counting squares, I'll use a ruler as well. 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. Okay, my pathway is going to be roughly 3/4 of an inch wide. Doesn't need to be a work of art. This is not to enter an art competition. This is a basic model to help you plan what's going to look great in the real world, what's going to function to meet your goals in the real world, and to help you order the right number of plants and the right amount of materials. And so from there, I also start drawing in stepping stones, logs, where I might want some rocks or stones, or areas for annual wildflowers. Instead of writing the plant names out, I'll use abbreviations and kind of create a key as I go. And oftentimes it'll be a super sloppy version at first, lots of erasing, cramming things in here and there. And then because you're working with tracing paper, you can put a layer on top, do a finer, cleaner drawing. And if you want to help you see the patterns of your plants, you can just get a cheap pack of colored pencils. Again, doesn't need to be a full artist set. That can get really expensive. It can just be a cheap pack, but with lots of different colors. And you can color it in. And again, it's not a work of art for me. It's just to see the patterns. And then if you want to color in your mulch layers or whatever to help things pop, you can do that. Not entering an art contest, just simple. And so then my front yard was almost like that. I ended up doing a slightly different version, kind of figuring it all out. And then to finish up the workshop, I'll show you it growing in. So this was it when we moved in. This was it when we applied for our turf replacement rebate and started working on killing our turf. Planting day. So you can see all the little 1 gallon plants. And because we had the meadow space, some of these are yarrow. We actually got in 4-inch. Pretty high planting density over here. Out here, this is kind of typical. And if you're working with larger shrubs, you might even have less. And I will always, and the people who I respect as really great planting designers as well, will always tell you from the plan, you will start doing layout and you will make changes that day. You will notice things. You will notice how something lines up with something in the background. The planting design is to get your concept and to get the right number of plants to the site to do your design. You might end up needing to go get 1 or 2 other things or having 1 or 2 extras. That's fine. It's not about mindlessly transferring what's on paper into your garden. It's about using what you put on paper as a model for that garden and then being able to have something that's even more beautiful. So here you can see our what called a French drain. It's a gravel filled trench as part of our rainwater solution here. You can see these are kind of some annual little weeds coming up, but will be taken care of by our mulching method. Here is it after planting. This is where most people think, oh, I should have ordered way more plants. I should have bought larger sizes. Don't bother. everything you can get in a 1-gallon pot, just do. They will start growing. Very rarely is there any reason to plant anything larger than a 1-gallon pot. Sometimes the trees, you can only find them in a larger size, but in a home garden, I will never plant a big box tree. Certain nurseries, not any of the ones I recommend, certain nurseries will make a lot of money by pitching people buy these huge plants. You don't need to do that. The smaller ones grow faster. Bringing in our mulch supplies. This was for a huge backyard as well. You won't need this much for a front yard. We have a class about compost and mulch for waterwise gardens. We talk a lot about mulches, choosing mulches, where to buy them, figuring out how much you need, and then sheet mulch. And so here, one of the things we did to get rid of our turf is smothering it with a temporary biodegradable weed barrier using recycled cardboard boxes. We have a whole workshop called Removing Your Turf the Right Way. We go through 4 different techniques, including sheet mulching in depth, get way into how to do that. There's always going to be some weeding afterwards, but we go through the pros and cons of different techniques in great detail. Definitely check it out before you would take the physical effort to do it yourself, because sometimes just one little technique makes a big difference. Here you can see, this is one of our trees planted from a tiny 1-gallon Western redbud. So after 2 months, things are starting to bloom, starting to grow, but still seems very open. 2.5 months working in the French drain, starting to bring in some other different kinds of rock and stone, tree stumps to make it look a little bit more natural. And then August of that same year, had this moment of, oh my gosh, you don't see all that wood chip anymore. It's a garden. You still don't see the design intent really, because things are just starting to grow in, where things are spaced farther apart. There's still some mulch, but this is that tiny 1-gallon redbud, large shrub, small tree, starting to go on its way. Depending on your site, it may or may not start to grow that fast. Our native plants love our soil in this area, and we have a good irrigation system, and we are not watering excessively, but good, deep, periodic establishment watering. Start to get some color, start to see some habitat in action, little indentions made by native leafcutter bees who like to chew up these edges of leaves. The plant doesn't care. They use them to create their nests. Dry stream bed, starting to have some plants grow in. So that's August of that year. If you build it, they will come. A little lady hummingbird who decided that she was going to live in our front yard for a good 2 weeks, probably every morning, saw her hanging out on this one dried grass stem, starting to grow in. Every time you plant a whole garden, you're always going to lose a few plants. Don't beat yourself up over it. Even in the most beautiful gardens in the glossy magazines, they always have plants that aren't thriving or dying. The professional photographers just don't take pictures of those plants, or they make sure that they're kind of in the background. Don't beat yourself up, learn from it. That's a point of inquiry and interest. Is this the right plant in the right place? What's going on there? Adapt. So this is about 6 months, starting to have lovely combinations of plants. Here is it from, had another 13 months, had another drop of mulch delivered for the backyard, and so stood on top of it. So you can kind of see the whole layout and some of the plant combinations coming together. The hedge takes a little while to grow in, but it's going. And by now we're at 3 years this spring. So we're just about this month, I think we're at 3 years in the ground. And these hedges have come all the way out to this edge, and now we clip them at the property line. Lovely texture combinations. This is the room that our cats mostly hang out in. So this is what they see, and they spend hours and hours just watching the birds and pollinators and stuff go by. So our trees, our Toyon and our Western redbud are still kind of growing in. We don't quite have the woodland effect yet, but that woodland edge is really starting to kind of come together. And by working with the seasonality of the native plants, it's a kind of a whole cascade of different things going on. So this is April, kind of the earlier spring, and one set of plants blooming, and then those plants kind of quiet down. And then in June, it's a whole other set. So it's a very dynamic place. And then just to kind of wrap it up, thank you very much. Or I know we're going over for some people. Thank you for continuing to be with us. I also want to provide that reality check, because even people who promote native plants, we tend to show things at the peak of bloom. All the magazines tend to show things at the peak of bloom. And then when you have your own garden and it doesn't look like that year round, people are thinking, what's wrong? No garden, not even the most beautiful gardens in Southern California, inland, in the fall after a heat wave, there's fires going on in the mountains. They don't look that fresh year round. No garden does. And if you have turf and you're thinking about replacing it, you know that sometimes your turf isn't looking that fresh year round anyway. So just to be realistic, so this is what this garden looks like in September, which is kind of there's still some blooms holding on. It's kind of the least floriferous time of the year. Now, over time, once this dark green looks kind of nice, dark green year-round hedge of coffeeberry and native cherry grows in, that's going to provide a nicer dark green backdrop, while this really floriferous stuff from the fall and earlier the spring and early summer is a little bit quieter and not at its peak form. And so that'll help provide some of the balance. But this is kind of realistic. You can see the penstemons are done blooming. They'll get a little bit of a clip back before spring, but I want to set you up to understand that all gardens have season, and the late summer, fall is by conventional standards the least attractive time in the garden. But it's hard to photograph. But even in this garden, between the blondes of the dried flower stems on this grass and the tans here, there is a lot of kind of dynamic stuff going on that's really interesting and beautiful once you turn into our seasons. And compared to like an East Coast garden that would just have nothing in the winter, everything would be cut back or covered in snow or dead for the season, there's a lot of beauty going on here in its own way. And so you can see here the yarrow, see the California coffeeberry still looks great. This is literally during a wildfire event in extreme heat. So you can see the ashes, but this is still very beautiful. We have, this is a Baja plant that doesn't match the garden theme at all, but one was available at the nursery and we love it. And it's great on the north side of a house. So we just put it in. There are no absolute rules. Right plant, right place in terms of sun, shade, water requirements, and it loves it there. Hollyleaf cherry, sunset manzanita. So really a base of these evergreens to hold during all times of the year. And so during the heat waves, when the flowering plants are not as active. And then if you are working with that, a lot of our heat wave stars we have in our backyard. So the native buckwheats, the late summer into the fall, the buckwheats really go into their own. This is that woolly blue curls. So in the late summer, fall, our front yard is less active, but especially with our desert plants in our backyard, they are really, really lovely. And so that's going to be where I will leave the workshop. Just want to show you a couple of other things for those of you who want to download the slides. I honestly never get through all of the slides, but I like to leave them here as resources for those who do want to download. So if you download the slides, you will get just some basic notes on mulches and designing for habitat. These are just little teasers, just some of the top concepts from those longer workshops on each of those topics, but it can provide you with some good kind of basics. If you're actually going to be doing it, check out those other workshops. It's really going to be worth your while in terms of being able to combine the design with the specifics of, okay, now how do you take that? And if you're thinking about a water feature for habitat, tons of information about that. If you're thinking about how to combine plants to best support birds in addition to the aesthetics, you'll be able to use all of these concepts together. So definitely check out that full workshop. And then what I also have at the end of this is there is a basic plant palette if you are just getting started in native gardens of some of my favorite native plants for this area. Now, this is kind of redundant with the information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, which is, I think, a more dynamic way to access this information, but I wanted to include it just as a little appendix of some of my very favorites. And again, please join us for the upcoming favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens. Again, for those of you who are more on the coast almost all of those grow well there as well. And we will kind of really go through one by one, and I will tell you what I love about all of these and more, and why you might consider it for your garden. And so with that, I am going to leave up as a last slide as we wrap up the workshop. Last question that we often get is, okay, so where around here do we buy these plants? So for those of you in LA through the kind of Inland Empire area, here are my top choices. And then some of the top plant information sources. And so what I'm going to do now, I know some of you are going to need to leave. If you can, before you need to leave, for those of you who don't want to stay for the last of the question and answers, please fill out this very quick evaluation poll. That really helps us out. It is, say, not the easiest thing to figure out how to teach these workshops in a limited amount of time, to really not just give you general information, but try to empower you to be able to do this stuff for yourself and hopefully connect you with the other information that you need to know. So I really take all of the feedback very seriously. In addition to the poll, for those of you who have time, if you can let me know in the chat if there's anything that you learned today from this that you know you're going to use or was particularly useful, or for those of you who have been thinking about this already, cleared up anything that was not clear to you, please let me know in the chat. I'm always trying to edit this presentation, cut some stuff out, add some stuff. I'll make sure to leave any of that really valuable stuff. If there's anything you didn't learn that you were hoping for, anything that wasn't clear, I'd love to know that as well in the chat, because I'm always trying to learn how to do this better. And so with that, for those of you who need to go, thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who want to stay for the rest of the question and answer, I'm going to start answering the questions. From George, how do you find out about native bees in your area? Any good resources? So, native bees. There is some information related to individual plants on Calscape, very general. There are some good regional guides. So some of those that I know of that are in books. So you might want to check any online bookseller that has an extensive catalog, and, you know, like Southern California bees or California bees. I have a few books that I use as references, but the titles unfortunately don't come to my mind right now. And then there is the national organization, nonprofit that really focuses on pollinators, which includes bees as well as some other insects, is the Xerces Society, Xerces Society. And they are a national organization, but some of their guide information is put out like 4 different regions. So hopefully that will help. Okay, question from Mark. We have boxwoods in 3-foot beds in the front of the house under the windows. My wife wants to keep them, but all the beds around the perimeter yard are on the same irrigation zone. So I'm looking for a water-wise plant to replace boxwoods. Any suggestions? Yeah, totally. For 3-foot deep bed, if it depends which way the house faces. If it faces north, my go-to would be the creeping barberry or creeping Oregon grape. It's about a 3-foot wide, knee to thigh, mid-thigh high. Awesome plant. Eventually creeps a little bit deeper, but easy to prune out. If it is facing kind of more sunward, what I would consider is the dwarf, one of the dwarf coffee berries. My go-to, just seems to be very tough, whether it's coastal or inland, is Eve Case coffee berry. If you are able to, when you're doing kind of landscape conversion, let it get a little bit deeper. To allow it to get 5-ish feet deep will be less pruning over time. And if it can be like mid-thigh up to maybe even hip high, that would be great. But they take pruning. And so I've seen them as foundation plantings clipped to be about 3 feet by maybe 3 feet, and they look great. And they don't grow super fast, so that's appropriate. It'll be less work than the boxwoods, most likely. East facing, yeah, I would look into Eve Case coffee berry, and I've seen great pictures online. If you just type into like Google image search Eve Case coffee berry and go to images, you'll be able to find a couple of pictures where they're being used kind of similarly. So question from George, What is the backbone of your front yard, redbud or Toyon? In some ways, as it's growing in, and I don't have any updated pictures, but I probably will next time I teach it, the hedge that is growing in, which is a combination of coffee berry, not the dwarf one, but the full-size one, but coffee berry and native cherry, which is also called hollyleaf cherry. And they're both kind of medium-sized shrubs that take pruning. So now I'm continuing to let them get taller, but I'm pruning them so they don't get much more than 5 feet wide, so they don't go into my neighbor's driveway or too far into my garden. That's becoming the evergreen backdrop, both from the driveway looking across the yard and even from like the room where I'm sitting now, because of the angles kind of looking out. And so that's the backdrop on one side. And then the other side, it is the redbud and the Toyon. So really that kind of background combination from the house looking out almost forms a U or a perimeter. And so I consider all of those to really be backbone plants. Okay, so that was that. Let's keep going. From Ellen. If I can even find some of my California native plants, is it too late to plant them in April with the high heat on the summer a few months away? Good question. The answer is it depends on your personal goals and your time and what your priorities are. The most extensive information to that would be, we have a workshop for that on our YouTube page, which is our installation and establishment of water wise and California native gardens class, where we talk about all of this in great detail. What I will say is most people, and myself included, and this is something that native plant nerds were literally getting to arguments about. Most people, I will say myself included, for the average home gardener who is not an expert, who's been growing native plants for years, will agree that in the fall, kind of for me, Thanksgiving to New Year's, inland is kind of the sweet spot for planting most native plants. Yeah, that's kind of the sweet spot. It lets plants get in where there's a little bit of growth often, especially if it's kind of more on the fall side. But then it has like time to root in and sort of transition slowly before the heat of spring, which will push a lot of growth, but could turn into summer heat really quickly. So if you have a lot of top growth, but the plant's not really ready to support itself, hasn't rooted in a ton into the native soil, you might get some issues. That being said, professional landscapers and contractors, as well as projects that I've been on where there's just a schedule, we plant when we have to plant in June. And if you do a really good job with your establishment watering, again, check out that installation and establishment class. If you're watering by hand, really good watering rings, that good deep soak usually once a month, or a really good irrigation system. If you're working with drip, you're going to have to do some hand watering still to transition the roots until they're in enough to access the drip. If you do all of that stuff well, most of your plants will live. You'll lose some, and then you could replant in the fall. So the answer is it depends. You know, as much as I really love to plant in the fall in my front yard because of just our moving in schedule, we didn't want to leave the front yard a mess for our new neighbors to see for a whole other year. We planted in March and we lost like one plant, that one plant that I showed you. So it kind of depends. Doesn't give you an exact answer. I would say if you are new to native plants and have the schedule availability to where maybe you do a really good job planning through the spring and summer. In the summer is the best time to kill your grass if you happen to have grass. You can learn why on our Killing Your Turf class. And then doing any irrigation work, any building dry stream beds, mounds or whatever, and being ready to plant next fall for a whole yard project, especially if you're a DIYer, that would be great. If you just have a couple of plants to replace in a planting bed, go ahead and plant them in April, as long as you won't be totally heartbroken if they happen to suffer some. And just remember the establishment watering is important. Yeah. Okay, so. Oh, Katie, also mentioned that Theodore Payne Foundation is offering a native bee workshop in late March. Awesome. Well, that's your best way if you're in Southern California to learn about native bees and local to our area. Any experience about goats grazing lawn? No, can't help you with that one. Do I recommend planting a single type of tree, or is planting a diverse group of them recommended? It depends what you're going for, but for me, generally a diverse group. As much as I generally will say, you don't necessarily want to do one of this, one of that, one of this, and one of that. For something like a tree, I end up doing one of this and one of that for a small or medium-sized yard, even in my pretty big backyard. I have a number of different Toyons, one being trained like a tree. The other ones are kind of shrubs on the perimeter of the house. But generally with trees, I'll do individuals. Now, if you want a grove of large trees, that might be a repetition of an oak. But for medium-sized trees, I'll often just whatever is going to work. If you're doing kind of trees in a row, so like for that narrow Catalina Island cherry, I do have a section of our backyard where we wanted kind of a taller screen. I do have a row of 3 of those, but then the next one's an elderberry. On the other side, the next one's a Toyon. Okay. Let's see. So now that we've gone quite a while past the end of the class, which is just fine, I am going to start checking to make sure that people are still here when I answer the questions. Let's see if Ellen is still here. Ellen is still here. Watering is my nemesis. We have zones currently set up, but the lines are only on a few trees right now. Would I recommend sprayers to mimic rain, or drip lines for the areas where I plan to plant California native plants? The answer is it depends, and it's kind of about the site and what's going to work best for you, as well as to some degree your design. Some people will passionately say drip is not good for native plants. I've grown many species of native plants, both on drip when it's better and on sprays. My default, as long as the plant heights won't be blocking high efficiency spray sprinklers, is to do high efficiency spray sprinklers. Or in my backyard, I don't even have a permanent in the ground bed system. I have a really kind of nice fan sprinkler, which costs like $60, but is incredibly adjustable and will last a very long time. And I just set that up as needed, where it's needed, and make sure that it's set up to only water that area. In my front yard, that's not going to work because of the shape of our wedge. That would water the neighbor's yard or the sidewalk or something like that. I have a high efficiency spray system, but as that hedge is growing in, it's starting to block things. And so I need to then modify it and keep it going. At work, we have a lot of zones where just because of the shape of the zone, we're growing native plants on drip irrigation and some on spray. So it just really depends. The full answer is I have an entire workshop about that. And that is called Retrofitting Turf Irrigation Systems for Water-Wise and California Native Plants. It teaches it from the assumption that someone might be retrofitting a yard and already have like an old sprinkler system that they want to use some of the pipe underground with and set it up to better support their native or water-wise plants. But you can use all of those concepts even if you need to start from scratch. And I also go over the hand watering option with the fan sprinkler, and we talk about the pros and cons of why. And then also there's supplemental videos if you're going to be trying to do some of the work yourself that kind of show step-by-step some of the key things. And so check out both our YouTube channel, which is that link at the top, cpwcd.org/YouTube, will give you the main class, Retrofitting Turf Irrigation Systems for Water-Wise and Native Plants. But if you go from that link back to like our main channel, you can find a whole playlist that also has lots of supplemental videos that go into some of the step-by-step stuff of like how to set up a drip zone, because there's ways that don't work well for supporting the roots of your plants long-term and ways that do. Definitely want to set you up for success. And then also figuring out how long to run one of those systems if you do put one of them in like we recommend. Okay, so have time for just a couple more questions from Mark. 60-foot, 6-foot high cinder block wall, southern full sun exposure,
3-foot wide, low planting wall along this wall. Creeping fig is currently covering it, will be removing it, all the other plants in the bed to replant with natives. What can I use to replace the creeping fig to cover the wall? What native would work for this 3-foot wide bed? The bed is bordered by a 2-foot wide sidewalk, which I discovered when removing some of the lawn. Creeping fig roots, I had no problem extending out. Yeah, okay, so that's, if you're thinking about a vine, there is no great, just like ready to go native substitute for creeping fig, which will actually like stick to the cinder block wall. When I redid my parents' backyard, which is surrounded by an ugly cinder block wall, we used creeping fig because there's no native direct alternative. The native vines that could work to swallow a wall will need some sort of trellising. So like native grape is great, but it loses all of its leaves and it takes a lot of pruning every year. There is, depending on where you live, there is a, I don't think it takes a ton of frost, but you can grow it in a lot of inland areas. There is a native, I'm remembering the Latin name. I'm blanking on the common name right now. It's called Calistegia macrocarpa anacapa pink. Oh, it's a native morning glory that can kind of swallow a wall, can swallow a chain link fence, but again, it needs a trellis to grow on. So yeah, that's going to be a little bit difficult. There's just not that many full sun, swallow a wall, low maintenance native vines, and they don't stick to the wall. For a 3-foot wide bed, you know, if it's something where a landscaper is going to be like shaving back a hedge on a regular basis, you can cram some things that really want to be a lot wider into a 3-foot wide bed. And then you might consider like maybe hollyleaf cherry or something like that, but it's going to take a lot of pruning. 3 feet is not a lot to work with for something that you want to be tall. So good luck. Let me know if you end up with something that grows in really nicely. I'll be interested to know on what you land on. So from George, would you consider that the combination of foliage texture is the foundation of successful design? Then it comes to foliage color, and last, the highly seasonal color of blossom. How would I prioritize when putting a design together? Yeah, if you're thinking about just the aesthetics and not the ecology of planting design, I would say that my order of operations tends to go with kind of like massing, you know, having a nice layering of background, middle ground, foreground, different heights of plants like that. That's kind of first for me. And then it's a combination of kind of color and texture together, just kind of for the overall aesthetic of the plant. So for example, you know, one of the really easy kind of color things is it a light leaf plant? Is it a dark leaf plant? But even amongst the light leaf plants, there's different sizes, but or colors, shades, but then even then the texture can really set it apart. So for example, if the actual leaf color on a deer grass versus a wider leaved shrub like Western redbud, if it's a similar tone of green, like the effect of the plant is still completely different. So I kind of think about color and texture together as aesthetic issues. And then, yes, to me, seasonal color of the blossom would go later, but my personal design process is for ecological purposes. I am making sure I have a lot of different flowers throughout as much of the year as possible. I don't worry about flower color, and it works itself out. So again, other people I know who are great designers do worry about flower color. Other people I know who are great designers don't worry about flower color. Like I know of designers who are much better at aesthetic design than I am, and they can fall into either of those camps with whether or not they worry about flower color. Okay, so we have a question from Susan. What might your thoughts be on a hop seed hedge? We've had some insect and fire blight issues. It's still a beautiful in bronze color. So hop seed, I've grown it before. Yeah, it's kind of a long-term, oftentimes like one or two will die is what I've seen. It's a low water plant. I don't know, it's not native to California. And not that that means it's automatically a bad thing, but I don't know of any of those like additional habitat benefits that come from it in the garden. I can't say that there are none. But it's not a plant that I am passionate about or would put in the design for like a medium-sized hedge. I would always look towards coffee berry, cherry, maybe mixing in, depending on growth rate or whatever, some of the ceanothus or manzanitas. If you need something taller, maybe working with Toyon. There's just so many great native plants that are surefire things in most gardens. Okay, so from George, any success or bad news about foothill pine, netleaf hackberry, and blue elderberry? Blue elderberry I use very often. Have one right outside on the other side of the wall in the room I'm in. It is an amazing habitat plant. It looks amazing seasonally, like right now when it's in full leaf and coming into flower. It's kind of a hot mess of a plant in terms of its form. It just kind of wants to grow how it wants to grow. I do pruning sometimes on them, depending on how visible they are. But it kind of flops all over the place. And depending on how it's situated in irrigation, they go dormant in the winter. They can also drop their leaves in the summer. So it depends what you want out of it. To me, that's a plant that does a lot of stuff and is fascinating, and the habitat is amazing. Some people would be like, yeah, it's not attractive enough for enough of the year. So it depends how you want to use it, but I love it. The bark is not very strong. It's kind of a weak and brittle bark. If you have one for a number of years, it will break some branches. So it's not really one to have picnics with little kids underneath, in my opinion. But as certainly like a large shrub, small tree, on the side of a garden. So I have it kind of like on this side of a house area that, because my lot's a wedge, is wider than a typical side yard, but not wide enough to do much with. And I love it there. Pinus cebiana, I've heard it can be kind of fussy as like a residential plant. I've never grown it. And Celtis reticulata, I've not personally grown it, but the Celtis are very, very generally tough and easy to grow. So if you're interested, I wouldn't hesitate to try it. Some of the Celtis can be very aggressive seeders, like into the mulch and coming up from little seedling plants, but that would be the only thing. Generally, they're very tough. Okay, last question, and then we will have to call it a workshop. Okay, from Mark, question on heat from walls. 2,500 square foot front yard that planning to convert to native plants for birds, butterflies, and pollinators next November. Awesome. Bordered by 2 cinder block walls, a 40-foot, 4-foot retaining wall topped by a 6-foot wood fence that is west facing with full summer sun exposure along 30 feet of its length. I'm planning to plant California coffeeberry and hollyleaf cherry along this part of the wall as a hedge in Yucaipa. So we're about 5 degrees cooler than the inland valley floor. Will heat coming off the wall be too intense for these to grow and cover the wall? I think you should be fine. Like I showed in that one thing, I've seen reflected heat, no irrigation, wild coffeeberry growing. The coffeeberry and cherry that I have in my hedge is next to a gravel strip and concrete driveway on my neighbor's property, and they have grown just fine. I think you'll be just fine. Just good establishment watering is always a good idea, but yeah, I would just make sure that that's getting what it needs, and I think those are good choices. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. This was a great Q&A session. There's still a lot of you here after 40 minutes almost of Q&A. So remember to sign up for our newsletter. Join us for other workshops if this is the first time joining us, and I look forward to reading all of the comments. I see a lot of them that have come in, and have a good rest of your weekend, everybody. Bye.